There's a clay tablet sitting in the British Museum right now. It has been sitting there for over 150 years. It was dug out of the ruins of Nineveh in the mid-1800s, catalogued, shelved, and mostly forgotten for decades. Scholars walked past it, curators filed it, and for a long time, nobody understood what they were actually looking at. Then, in 1880, a man named George Smith translated it, and what he found inside those ancient cuneiform marks rewrote everything we thought we knew about the Bible, about history, and about the ancient world. The tablet described a catastrophic event, fire raining from the sky, 2 cities destroyed in a single night, an entire civilization erased from the map, the survivors fleeing in terror, looking back to see a wall of smoke rising from the earth like a second sunrise. The Bible tells the same story: Sodom and Gomorrah, fire and brimstone from heaven, 2 cities consumed in divine wrath, a pillar of salt, a judgment so total and so violent that it burned itself into the memory of an entire civilization for thousands of years. But here is what the official textbooks will not tell you. The Sumerian tablet predates the biblical account by more than 2,000 years. The cuneiform record of that event, pressed into wet clay by a scribe who lived before Abraham was born, before Moses walked out of Egypt, before the Hebrew language even existed as we know it, describes the same catastrophe, the same cities, the same fire from the sky, the same total destruction. So the question is not whether this event happened. The physical evidence says it did. The question is what caused it. And the answer the ancient Sumerians gave, the answer they pressed into that clay tablet in the language of the oldest civilization on Earth, is not an act of God in the way we understand that phrase. It is something far stranger, something that sounds to modern ears less like mythology and more like a weapons detonation report. If you want to know the truth about what fell on those cities more than 4,000 years ago, stay with me, because the answer is in the tablets, and the tablets have been hiding in plain sight for over a century. If this channel gives you the history they buried in the textbooks, subscribe right now and hit the bell. Every week, we go where the mainstream historians refuse to follow. The story begins not in the Middle East, but in the ambition of a 19th century British Museum curator named Austen Henry Layard, who in 1845 began excavating the ancient mound of Kuyunjik, sitting on the eastern bank of the Tigris River, directly across from the modern city of Mosul, in what is now northern Iraq. Layard was not looking for anything specific. He was doing what archaeologists of his era did, digging into mounds that locals called tells, knowing that civilizations tend to build on top of civilizations, that history accumulates in layers of mud and ash and broken pottery, the way sediment accumulates at the bottom of a slow river. What Layard found was not just a city. He found a library. Specifically, he found what remained of the great library of Ashurbanipal, the last of the truly great Assyrian kings who ruled from Nineveh from 668 to 627 BCE, and who had the foresight to collect, copy, and preserve the written knowledge of every civilization his empire absorbed. Ashurbanipal's scribes copied texts from Babylon, from Akkad, from Sumer. They pressed cuneiform signs into clay tablets and fired those tablets in kilns, creating records designed to survive for thousands of years. They were right about that. When Layard's team began pulling these tablets from the ruins, they found over 30,000 of them, 30,000 clay tablets, many cracked, many broken into fragments, but tens of thousands still readable, still bearing the marks of scribes who had been dead for 2.5 millennia. The tablets were shipped to the British Museum, and there they sat, waiting for someone who could read them. George Smith was not a trained scholar. He was the son of a craftsman, self-educated, working as an apprentice banknote engraver when he began spending his lunch hours at the British Museum, teaching himself cuneiform from the published translations available at the time. The museum's keepers noticed his unusual ability and hired him as a technician, and it was George Smith who, in 1872, made the discovery that shocked the world. He found a tablet describing a great flood, a survivor building a boat, animals taken aboard in pairs, the flood covering the earth, and a bird sent out to find dry land. He had found the Mesopotamian flood story, a text that predated the biblical account of Noah by over 1,000 years. The discovery caused a sensation. The Times of London published it on the front page. Scholars and clergy alike were stunned. If the Mesopotamian flood story existed before the Hebrew Bible, then what did that mean about the Bible's origins? What did it mean about the uniqueness of the events it described? But the flood tablet was not the only remarkable document in that collection. Lost among 30,000 fragments, noticed by few and understood by even fewer, was a much smaller tablet, a technical document, a record that described not water falling from the sky, but fire. And the object it described falling from the sky, the object that caused those cities to burn, was written in language so specific, so technical, so precise, that modern researchers who have spent careers studying it have come to a deeply uncomfortable conclusion. The ancient Sumerian scribe who wrote that tablet was not describing an act of divine wrath. He was describing an event that someone at some point in the oral tradition leading to that tablet had actually witnessed. And what he described in the careful technical language of the oldest writing system on Earth was something falling from the sky with the trajectory, the velocity, and the destructive yield of a very large impactor, or something else. Something that a civilization with no word for aircraft, no concept of chemical propulsion, no framework for understanding advanced technology might have described in the only language available to them, the language of gods, of divine weapons, of fire sent by beings from the heavens. We will come back to that. First, let us understand the tablet itself, because most people, even most people who have heard of this discovery, do not know the details, and the details are everything. The tablet is known to researchers as the planisphere. Its official British Museum catalog number is K8538. It is a circular clay disc approximately 10 centimeters in diameter, which, in the ancient world, was a standard format for astronomical records. The front face of the tablet is divided into 8 segments, like slices of a pie, and each segment contains cuneiform text alongside what are clearly astronomical notations: positions of stars, trajectories, angular measurements. It was initially classified as an astronomical tablet, probably a star chart, and filed away accordingly. Scholars examined it periodically over the decades following its discovery and could make partial sense of it. Some of the star names were recognizable. Some of the astronomical notations could be cross-referenced with known Babylonian star catalogs. But other portions of the tablet remained puzzling. The notations in certain segments did not match anything in the known astronomical record. And a cluster of words in one particular segment resisted translation for decades, because the vocabulary was not vocabulary you would expect in an astronomical document. It was not until 2008 that 2 researchers, Alan Bond and Mark Hemsel, both aerospace engineers with academic backgrounds in astrophysics, published a paper arguing that they had finally decoded the full meaning of the planisphere. And what they argued, supported by detailed astronomical reconstruction using modern computer software, was extraordinary. The planisphere, they said, was not a star chart. It was an observation log. Specifically, it was a record of an object observed by a Sumerian astronomer on a specific night in a specific year, moving across the sky on a specific trajectory, and ultimately impacting the Earth with catastrophic force. Bond and Hemsel, using software that can reconstruct the exact position of every star in the sky on any night in history, from any location on Earth, match the star positions recorded on the planisphere to a specific date, the 29th of June, 31-1-23 BCE. They matched the trajectory notations to a specific incoming vector, and when they ran the calculations, when they followed that trajectory to its logical conclusion, the object described on that ancient clay tablet impacted somewhere in the Eastern Alps region, releasing energy equivalent to a multi-gigaton airburst. The shockwave from an impact of that magnitude would have traveled across the landscape at thousands of kilometers per hour. The thermal pulse alone would have ignited fires across a radius of hundreds of kilometers, and the debris field, the burning material thrown up by the impact and raining back down across a massive area, would have looked to anyone watching from a distance exactly like fire falling from the sky, exactly like brimstone, exactly like what the Bible describes falling on Sodom and Gomorrah, exactly like what the Sumerian scribe pressed into that clay disk more than 5,000 years ago. But here is where the story gets complicated. Here is where the mainstream explanation, the pure asteroid explanation, begins to run into problems that most researchers prefer not to discuss in peer-reviewed journals. Because if this was simply an asteroid impact, then the story of the planisphere is remarkable, but ultimately explainable. A natural disaster, a cosmic accident, something that happened before recorded history in any language we currently understand, preserved in the memory of survivors, eventually codified into the religious literature of multiple civilizations. Terrible, traumatic, but natural. Except the Sumerian tablets do not describe it as natural. They are extraordinarily specific about what caused the fire. And the cause they describe is not an unguided rock from space. It is a weapon wielded by beings the Sumerians called the Anunnaki. To understand why that matters, we need to understand who the Anunnaki were. Not the popular culture version, not the simplified version that has been circulating in alternative history circles since the 1970s, but the actual Sumerian textual record, the tablets themselves, the oldest written mythology on Earth, which describes these beings in terms that, once you strip away the mythological framing, sound disturbingly like a description of a technologically advanced civilization operating on Earth in the distant past. The word Anunnaki in Sumerian means roughly those who from heaven to earth came, or in some translations, the princely seed, or the great ones. The translation is contested, as most ancient language translations are, because cuneiform is a complex logographic system where individual signs can carry multiple meanings depending on context. But the consistent thread across all translations, across all the different schools of Sumerology that have approached these texts, is that the Anunnaki were beings who came from somewhere else, from above, from the sky, from what the Sumerians called An, meaning heaven or sky, as distinct from Ki, meaning earth. This is not a metaphor. The Sumerians were extremely precise people. They invented the 60-minute hour and the 360-degree circle, systems we still use today. They developed the first writing system, the first legal code, the first schools, the first libraries. They calculated the movement of celestial bodies with an accuracy that modern astronomers have confirmed is surprisingly sophisticated for a civilization without telescopes. When Sumerian texts distinguish between things that come from An, the sky, and things that come from Kai, the earth, they are making a specific geographical distinction, not a theological one. The Anunnaki, in the oldest Sumerian texts, are not metaphors for natural forces. They are described as individual beings with names, with personalities, with hierarchies, with internal politics, with conflicts and alliances and grudges that span centuries. They have physical descriptions, they use tools, they issue commands, they make decisions, they make mistakes. And in the texts that deal with the destruction of the cities, the Anunnaki are specifically described as making a decision to destroy those cities using a weapon. And the weapon they are described as using sounds in the technical vocabulary available to a Sumerian scribe, like something that produces a massive destructive blast from above. Let us look at those texts specifically, because this is where the evidence becomes difficult to dismiss if you read it carefully and honestly. The primary Sumerian text dealing with the destruction of the cities of the plain is known to scholars as the lamentation over the destruction of Sumer and Ur. It is one of the best preserved Sumerian literary texts we have, existing in multiple copies from multiple sites, which means it was considered important enough to copy repeatedly over centuries. It is a long, formal document, the kind of text that would have been read aloud at religious ceremonies, that would have been taught to scribes in the Aduba, the Sumerian schools. It was not a fringe document. It was part of the core literary canon of the most literate civilization on Earth in the 3rd millennium BCE. The text describes the destruction of multiple cities in the Sumerian heartland. Cities we can identify archaeologically, cities whose ruins exist today, cities that show evidence in the archaeological record of having been abandoned suddenly and completely around the time period the tablets describe. And the destruction is explicitly attributed to a divine weapon. Not divine wrath in the abstract, not a flood or a plague, but a specific weapon with specific properties. The text uses terms that describe a powerful, harmful command or force that travels through the air and causes devastation. It describes a wind that came from above. It describes the land becoming like a place where nothing had ever grown. It describes the people being unable to breathe. It describes animals fleeing in panic. It describes the sky being darkened. Scholars who read this text purely as mythology file these descriptions under the category of poetic elaboration. Metaphor, the ancient mind making sense of trauma through the language of divine agency. And that is a valid reading. That is the standard reading. But there is another reading, a reading that does not require you to accept anything supernatural, a reading that requires only that you take the ancient Sumerians at their word and ask what kind of event could produce the effects they describe. Because the effects they describe, the inability to breathe, the darkened sky, the sudden total devastation, the landscape that looked like nothing had ever grown there, the wind from above, these are not the effects of a conventional military attack. They are not the effects of conquest or fire or even a conventional natural disaster. They are, however, the effects of a large-scale airburst event, an asteroid or comet exploding in the atmosphere above a populated area. The inability to breathe would be explained by the sudden displacement of oxygen in the blast wave, followed by superheated air, followed by toxic particulate matter. The darkened sky would be explained by the massive debris cloud thrown up by the impact. The wind from above would be the characteristic downward blast of an airburst, the overpressure wave that travels downward before it spreads outward. The landscape that looks like nothing had ever grown there would match what we see in the archaeological record of cities that suffered sudden catastrophic abandonment. But here is the question that the asteroid explanation cannot answer by itself. If this was a natural airburst event, a rock from space hitting the atmosphere and exploding, why do the Sumerian texts treat it not as a natural disaster, but as a deliberate act? Why do they name the specific beings who authorized the weapon? Why do they name the specific beings who deployed it? Why do they record the debate that took place before the destruction? A debate in which certain Anunnaki argued against the decision and others supported it. Natural disasters do not have debates attached to them. Natural disasters do not have named perpetrators. Natural disasters do not generate after-action reports describing the decision-making process that led to them. But the Sumerian texts do exactly that. They record not just the event, but the reasoning behind it. The political situation that made the destruction seem necessary. The objections raised by those who thought it was too extreme. The final authorization given by the highest authority in the Anunnaki hierarchy. That hierarchy, and the specific individuals within it who are named in connection with the destruction of the cities, is the next piece of this puzzle. And understanding it requires us to go deeper into the Sumerian textual record than most people ever go. Because the tablets do not just describe the Anunnaki as a vague category of divine beings. They describe a specific organizational structure, a chain of command, a set of relationships between named individuals that is consistent across hundreds of different texts from dozens of different sites spanning thousands of years of Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian literature. The king of the Anunnaki in the Sumerian texts is a being named Anu. He rules from what the texts describe as a great dwelling in the sky. His two sons are named Enlil and Enki, and the relationship between these two brothers is the central drama of Sumerian mythology, the conflict that drives most of the major events described in the tablets, including the decision to destroy the cities. Enlil is the elder son and his father's designated heir. His domain is the earth itself, and he functions in the texts as the authority figure for all Anunnaki operations on the ground. He is often described as stern, rigid, unwilling to bend rules, prone to extreme reactions when the established order is violated. The texts describe him as the one who holds the tablets of destiny, the documents that encode the fundamental laws governing both gods and humans. His symbol is the storm and the wind, and the weapon associated with him is called the deluge, the Great Flood, the event described in the Mesopotamian flood narrative. Enki is the younger son, and his relationship with Enlil is the central tension of the entire Sumerian literary tradition. Enki is described as the god of wisdom, of deep water, of the Abzu, the underground freshwater reservoir that the Sumerians believed lay beneath the earth. He is creative where Enlil is regulatory. He is flexible where Enlil is rigid. He is associated with technology, with genetic knowledge, with the creation of humanity itself in the Sumerian creation narrative. And critically, in almost every major crisis described in the Sumerian texts, it is Enki who objects to Enlil's extreme solutions and who finds ways to protect at least some of humanity from the consequences. This pattern Enlil decides to destroy. Enki finds a way to save someone, repeats itself across the Sumerian literary tradition with remarkable consistency. In the flood narrative, it is Enlil who decides to destroy humanity with water, and it is Enki who secretly warns the flood hero, who in the Sumerian version is named Ziusudra, to build a boat and survive. In the destruction of the cities, the same dynamic plays out, and the specific individual named in some of the texts as the voice who warned the residents of at least one of the targeted cities is consistent with this pattern. The cities targeted for destruction in the Sumerian texts are not named Sodom and Gomorrah. Those are the Hebrew names that appear in the much later biblical account. The Sumerian texts refer to them differently, but the characteristics of the cities, their location in a fertile plain, their wealth, their size, their prominence, and the specific nature of their transgression against the Anunnaki order are consistent with the cities described in the biblical narrative in ways that are too specific to be coincidental. The transgression itself is described in the Sumerian texts in terms that are partly moral and partly political. There is a sense in the texts that the targeted cities had become powerful in ways that threatened the established Anunnaki order, that their inhabitants had acquired, or were acquiring, or were in proximity to, knowledge or capabilities that the Anunnaki hierarchy had determined should remain restricted. This is a theme that recurs throughout the Sumerian literary tradition. The idea that certain types of knowledge, certain types of power, certain types of capability were considered the exclusive domain of the Anunnaki, and that human acquisition of those things was treated as an existential threat requiring drastic response. This is also notably the same theme that runs through the biblical account. The sin of Sodom and Gomorrah in the Bible is described in terms that have generated centuries of theological debate, but the core of it, beneath all the later interpretive layers, seems to be about a violation of boundaries, about humans doing something they were not supposed to do, about a transgression so severe that the only response considered proportionate was total destruction. What that transgression was specifically, and why it warranted such a response, is something the texts are careful not to be entirely direct about. But reading across multiple Sumerian documents, certain patterns emerge. The cities of the plain appear in the texts in contexts involving advanced metallurgy, involving trade routes that connected to other technologically sophisticated centers, involving proximity to what some texts describe as sacred sites where Anunnaki technology was stored or operated. And here is where the alternative history researchers, the people working outside mainstream academia, have made observations that deserve serious consideration, even if the academic establishment is not ready to make them. Because when you map the geographical references in the Sumerian texts, when you cross-reference them with the archaeological evidence for what was actually happening in the ancient Near East, around the time period these texts describe, certain things align in ways that are not comfortable to look at directly. The most significant of those alignments involves a site that was not discovered until 2015, a site located in the Jordan Valley that has been excavating under the direction of a team including archaeologist Philip Sylvia and has been the subject of increasingly remarkable findings. The site is called Tal el-Hammam. And what the archaeologists found there has forced the scientific community to confront something it would very much prefer not to confront. Tal el-Hammam shows clear evidence of having been destroyed in a single event of extraordinary violence sometime around 1650 BCE, which is within the range of dates proposed for the cities of the plain by various biblical chronologies. The destruction layer at Tal el-Hammam is not the kind of destruction layer you see from conquest, or from fire, or from earthquake. It is the kind of destruction layer you see from a cosmic airburst event. The pottery shards at the site show evidence of having been heated to temperatures far exceeding what any conventional fire could produce, temperatures in excess of 2,000 degrees Celsius. The bones found in the destruction layer show the same evidence of extreme heat. Mud brick structures at the site show evidence of having melted, not burned, melted, which again requires temperatures that conventional fire sources simply cannot reach. The destruction layer contains spherules, tiny glass beads formed when material is subjected to extreme heat and then rapidly cooled. The same kind of spherules found at documented asteroid impact sites. It contains shocked quartz, a mineral that forms only under the kind of extreme pressure generated by hypervelocity impacts. It contains a layer of salt, which matches a scenario in which the explosion vaporized the waters of the nearby Dead Sea and rained brine across the surrounding area. And the site shows evidence of having been abandoned not just at the time of the destruction, but for centuries afterward. The land was not resettled. Agriculture did not resume. The area was treated as if it were cursed, off limits, a place where something had happened that made it impossible or forbidden to return. This matches exactly what the Sumerian texts describe, the land becoming like a place where nothing grows, the absence of people, the sense of permanent desolation. And it matches exactly what the Bible describes, Lot's wife looking back and becoming a pillar of salt, the utter destruction of the cities and all the surrounding plain. Abraham looking from a distance and seeing the smoke rising from the land like the smoke of a furnace. The scientific paper published by Sylvia's team in Nature in 2021 confirmed the airburst scenario. A cosmic impact, probably an asteroid or comet fragment, exploded in the atmosphere above the Jordan Valley sometime around 1650 BCE, generating a thermal pulse hot enough to melt rock and pottery, a shock wave powerful enough to collapse buildings, and a debris field that rained fire and burning material across a wide area for miles in every direction. That is the scientific consensus as of the most recent research. An airburst, a cosmic event, a natural catastrophe of extraordinary violence that destroyed a prosperous Bronze Age city and the surrounding agricultural settlements in a matter of seconds. The mainstream scientific explanation stops there. Natural disaster. Terrible, but explicable. The kind of event that happens randomly, rarely, but with devastating consequences when it does. No further explanation required. No further questions asked. But the questions demand to be asked, because the Sumerian texts that predate the biblical account by 2,000 years, texts that were written by a civilization that had no knowledge of the specific city of Tal el-Hammam, texts that were written in a language that was already ancient when Abraham was born, describe this event in terms that go far beyond a natural disaster. They name the beings who authorized it. They describe the deliberation that preceded it. They record the weapon used to execute it. And they describe the aftermath in terms that include specific details, the inability to breathe, the utter desolation of the land, the salt, the darkness, that are now confirmed by the physical evidence in the destruction layer at Tal el-Hammam. The mainstream scientific establishment looks at this coincidence and says remarkable. They say that the ancient Sumerians must have had oral traditions preserving the memory of this natural catastrophe, and that those oral traditions eventually found their way into the literary record of multiple ancient Near Eastern civilizations, including the Hebrews. They say that the Anunnaki framing, the divine deliberation, the name perpetrators, the description of a weapon, these are simply the mythological overlay that ancient humans placed on top of natural events they could not otherwise explain. That is a possible explanation. It is internally consistent. It does not require you to believe anything outside the boundaries of accepted scientific understanding. But it has a problem. Several problems, actually. And those problems become more serious the more carefully you look at them. The first problem is specificity. The Sumerian texts are not vague. They are not the kind of generalized mythological narrative that you would expect from a purely oral tradition preserving the memory of a natural disaster. They are specific in ways that go far beyond what oral tradition typically preserves. They name specific beings with specific roles in a specific hierarchy, making specific decisions based on specific political and strategic considerations, and using a specific weapon deployed in a specific way. The level of operational detail in the destruction narrative is inconsistent with the mythological overlay theory. Mythological overlays tend to reduce events to their symbolic essence. They tend to preserve the what and the consequence, but lose the how and the why. The Sumerian destruction texts preserve all four, and they preserve them with a consistency across multiple independent texts from multiple sites that suggest they are not elaborating freely on a remembered natural disaster, but preserving, with whatever fidelity ancient scribal culture could manage, an account of something that actually happened in the way they describe it. The second problem is the weapon itself. The Sumerian texts do not just say that fire fell from the sky. They say a specific thing was sent by specific beings for a specific purpose, and that it had specific characteristics. One of the most significant of those characteristics is described in texts dealing with a related event, the destruction of the city of Ur, which appears to have occurred around the same time period. The texts describing the destruction of Ur use vocabulary that translates roughly as an evil wind, a wind that kills, a wind that no one can escape, a wind that makes the land desolate. They describe people hiding in their houses and still dying. They describe entire populations being wiped out not by fire, but by something that traveled through the air and killed indiscriminately. Scholars classify this as poetic description of a military defeat, combined with mythological elaboration. But the physical symptomology described, people dying indoors, inability to escape even by sheltering, total population death across a wide area, is not the symptomology of conventional military defeat. It is the symptomology of an area denial weapon, something that contaminates the air over a wide area and makes it impossible to breathe safely, regardless of whether you're in the open or in a structure. The obvious modern parallel, the parallel that makes academic historians deeply uncomfortable, is a chemical or radiological weapon, a weapon that disperses a toxic or radioactive agent over a wide area, killing everything that breathes the air and leaving the land uninhabitable for an extended period afterward. The third problem is the archaeological record itself, because Tal el-Hammam is not the only site in the region showing evidence of sudden catastrophic destruction around this time period. Multiple sites in the Jordan Valley and the surrounding area show destruction layers from approximately the same period. And while some of those destruction layers are consistent with the kind of gradual abandonment that follows military defeat or environmental change, others show the same signature of sudden, violent, high-temperature destruction that Tal el-Hammam shows. The distribution of those sites, their geographical relationship to one another, the radius of destruction, is consistent with either multiple simultaneous cosmic impact events, which would be extraordinarily unlikely from a statistical standpoint, or a single very large airburst event that destroyed multiple settlements across a wide area simultaneously, or a deliberate pattern of destruction using some kind of high-energy weapon system deployed across multiple targets in the same region in the same time period. The fourth problem is the survival pattern. The biblical account and the Sumerian texts both describe someone being warned in advance and escaping the destruction. In the Bible, it is Lot and his family. In the Sumerian tradition, there are references to individuals connected to specific Anunnaki figures being warned before the destruction took place. This pattern of a warning given to specific individuals before a catastrophe that destroys everyone else is, again, not consistent with a purely natural disaster. Natural disasters do not come with warnings given selectively to specific people by named authorities. They do not discriminate in their destruction based on prior intelligence. But weapons do. Weapons are deployed with intent, and if someone is deploying a weapon, they can choose to warn specific individuals in advance. They can choose to spare specific people. They can orchestrate who lives and who dies. The implications of that, if taken seriously, are staggering. Because what it would mean is that the ancient Sumerians were not mythologizing a natural disaster. They were recording, in the best available language and conceptual framework, the reality of a civilization with weapons technology so advanced that it could target specific geographic areas, destroy them completely, and selectively preserve the lives of chosen individuals who had been warned in advance to evacuate. That is not mythology. That is a military operation. A targeted strike against specific settlements by a force with access to high-energy weapons, conducted with sufficient command and control capability to manage both the strike itself and the evacuation of protected individuals. The Sumerians called the beings who conducted that operation the Anunnaki. They described them as coming from the sky, as living for enormously long spans of time, as possessing technology that human civilization could not replicate, as having created humanity itself through a process of genetic modification applied to earlier hominid species, and as having maintained active control over human civilization for thousands of years before the destruction of the cities. Now, at this point in any documentary about ancient astronaut theory, there is a fork in the road. There is the path of pure speculation, where every unsolved mystery is attributed to extraterrestrial technology, where every anomalous artifact becomes proof of alien intervention, where the evidence is shaped to fit a predetermined conclusion. That is not the path we are taking. The path we are taking is harder and more uncomfortable than pure speculation. It is the path of reading the texts as carefully and honestly as we can, of cross-referencing them with the physical evidence, of acknowledging where the mainstream explanation works and where it does not, and of asking what the most parsimonious explanation actually is when you lay everything out on the table. And when you do that, when you read the Sumerian texts with the same rigor that you would apply to any other ancient historical document, when you cross-reference them with the archaeological evidence, when you take seriously the physical findings at sites like Tal el-Hammam, the most parsimonious explanation is not a natural disaster mythologized by primitive minds. The most parsimonious explanation is that something extraordinary happened in the ancient Near East around 4,000 years ago, that it happened with a degree of deliberation and control that natural disasters do not possess, that it was witnessed and recorded by the most sophisticated scribal culture of the ancient world, and that those records have been sitting in museums and universities for 150 years, waiting for someone to take them seriously enough to ask what they are actually describing. The Sumerian texts take them seriously. The physical evidence takes them seriously. The only group that has consistently refused to take them seriously is the mainstream academic establishment, which has very strong professional and institutional reasons to prefer the mythology explanation over the alternative. We're going to spend the rest of this documentary taking them seriously. And what we're going to find is that the trail of evidence, followed honestly and without a predetermined destination, leads somewhere that most people are not prepared to go. It leads to the conclusion that the fire that fell on those cities was not an accident. It was not a natural disaster mythologized by people who could not understand what they were seeing. It was a deliberate act, conducted by beings with technology we do not yet understand, for reasons that were recorded at the time by the civilization closest to the event, in a language that has now been deciphered well enough for us to read what they said. The question is whether we are brave enough to believe them. To understand why that question matters so much, we need to go deeper into the Sumerian creation tradition, because the story of the cities and their destruction cannot be understood in isolation. It can only be understood as part of a much larger narrative, a narrative that spans thousands of years in the Sumerian textual record, a narrative that begins not with humanity, but with the Anunnaki themselves, with their arrival on Earth, with their reasons for coming here, and with the relationship they established with humanity that eventually led to the catastrophic decisions described in the destruction texts. The oldest Sumerian creation texts describe the Anunnaki arriving on Earth before humanity existed, before any human civilization. At a time when the Earth was, in the language of the texts, a place of darkness and water, a primordial landscape not yet organized for habitation. The number of Anunnaki described in the earliest texts is consistent across multiple sources. There are exactly 300 Anunnaki described as stationed on Earth, with another 300 described as remaining in the heavens. The beings stationed on Earth have specific assignments, specific territories, specific tasks. They are organized like a military or corporate hierarchy. They have ranks, they have defined responsibilities. The task they are initially given, the reason they came to Earth in the first place, is described in the texts in terms that have generated enormous controversy among both mainstream scholars and alternative researchers. The texts say the Anunnaki came to Earth to work. Specifically, they came to extract something from the Earth. And after a long period of doing this work themselves, after what the texts describe as an uprising or mutiny among the working Anunnaki who had grown exhausted by the labor, the decision was made to create a worker species, a being capable of doing the labor the Anunnaki needed done, without requiring the Anunnaki themselves to do it. The being created for this purpose is called, in the Sumerian texts, the Lulu, the primitive worker. And the process by which the Lulu was created is described in the Sumerian texts in terms that, once you translate them as literally as the language allows, sound remarkably like a description of genetic engineering. The texts describe Enki and a female Anunnaki named Ninhursag mixing the essence of a young Anunnaki, specifically described as blood or clay or image, with the egg of a female of an already existing species. They describe a process of creation involving a kind of vessel or container, and they describe multiple attempts and failures before a viable being is produced. They describe the resulting being as a hybrid, capable of reproduction in some versions of the story, and not capable in others, with different texts representing what may be different stages of the experiment. And they describe the Anunnaki as being initially pleased with this creation, and eventually troubled by it as the created species proved more capable and more autonomous than anticipated. This narrative is not unique to Sumer. Versions of it appear in the Akkadian texts, in the Babylonian texts, in fragments of Canaanite mythology, and in distorted echoes in the biblical Genesis narrative. The idea that humanity was created not by pure divine fiat, but by a deliberate process involving the combination of divine and earthly elements, the idea that the creator beings had specific purposes in mind when they made humanity, the idea that humanity's capabilities eventually grew to threaten or alarm the creator beings. These themes are remarkably consistent across the earliest written records of multiple ancient Near Eastern civilizations. And they matter for understanding the destruction of the cities because the destruction, according to the Sumerian texts, was not primarily about moral failing in the way the Bible later frames it. It was about capability. It was about the cities having developed, or being in the process of developing, or being in proximity to, something that the Anunnaki hierarchy had determined was too dangerous to allow to continue existing. The specific capability in question is described in the texts in ways that are frustratingly indirect, but, read carefully, seem to point to something involving the kind of technical or scientific knowledge that the Anunnaki considered their exclusive domain. The cities of the plain, in the Sumerian geographical imagination, are associated with the region that was the crossroads of multiple trade routes and multiple cultural traditions. They were wealthy. They were sophisticated. They had access to metallurgical knowledge, to astronomical knowledge, to agricultural techniques that represented, in the Bronze Age world, the cutting edge of human technological development. More significantly, some of the texts suggest that the cities had access to, or were seeking access to, what one set of texts describes as the Me, the divine laws or sacred objects that encoded the fundamental organizational principles of civilization. The Mi are described in the Sumerian texts as physical objects, things that could be carried, stored, stolen, given, and taken away. They are listed in the texts with remarkable specificity: kingship, priesthood, descent into the underworld, weapons, legal procedure, writing, mathematics, music, medicine. Each of these domains had an associated Mi, an object or set of objects that encoded the knowledge and authority required to practice that domain. The Mi were kept by the Anunnaki. They were distributed to human cities selectively, as the Anunnaki hierarchy saw fit, which is why different cities in the Sumerian tradition are described as having different specializations, different areas of knowledge, different capabilities. Ur had certain Mi, Uruk had others. Nippur, the religious center of the Sumerian world, had the most sacred of the Mi, the ones associated with the highest Anunnaki authority. The cities of the plain are described in some of the texts dealing with the period immediately before their destruction as having been engaged in something that involved the Mi in an unauthorized way, as having sought or acquired or threatened to acquire Mi that had not been granted to them. This is the political context that the texts say the Anunnaki were responding to when they made the decision to destroy the cities. Not pure moral outrage, not divine wrath provoked by the sexual misbehavior that the later biblical tradition would emphasize, but a strategic decision made by a specific authority within the Anunnaki hierarchy to eliminate a threat to the established order. That decision, the texts are clear about this, was not unanimous. Enki opposed it. Enki argued that the cities and their people should be given a chance to reform, or that they should be punished in some less total way, or that certain individuals should be spared. His argument was overruled by Enlil, who held the higher authority on Earth and who had the more powerful constituency within the Anunnaki hierarchy, and the weapon was authorized. Now, let us be precise about what the texts actually say about the weapon, because this is where the alternative history community often overreaches, and where it is important to stay as close to the actual text as the text allows. The Sumerian texts do not use the word nuclear, they do not use the word missile. They do not use any vocabulary that corresponds directly to modern weapons technology, because no such vocabulary existed in 3rd millennium Sumerian. What they use is the vocabulary available to them, which is the vocabulary of divine power, of divine tools, of divine commands that manifest as physical forces in the world. The weapon associated with Enlil in the destruction texts is called by several names across different texts. In some it is called the Great Storm. In some it is called the Deluge of Enlil. In some it is called a fire that came down from above and destroyed everything it touched. In the specific texts dealing with the destruction of the cities of the plain, the weapon is described in terms that emphasize its ability to kill without conventional fire, its ability to create a wind of death that moves across the land, its ability to leave behind a landscape that is permanently altered, unable to sustain life in the way it did before. Zecharia Sitchin, the researcher who brought Sumerian alternative history to a popular audience in the 1970s and 1980s, interpreted these descriptions as referring to nuclear weapons. Specifically, he argued that the Anunnaki used nuclear devices to destroy the cities, and that the resulting fallout was what caused the extended period of desolation described in the texts. His interpretation has been widely criticized by mainstream scholars, primarily because Sitchin's translations are often loose, and because his conclusions go far beyond what the text can be made to say with scholarly rigor. But Sitchin's critics, in dismissing his methodology, have often dismissed his core observation along with it. And the core observation, which can be made on the basis of careful translation without Sitchin's interpretive leaps, is valid. The Sumerian texts describe a weapon that killed not just through fire and blast, but through something that remained in the air and the land afterward, something that prevented resettlement, something that made the affected area uninhabitable for an extended period. And that characteristic, the extended uninhabitability, the death not just from immediate blast and heat, but from something that persisted in the environment afterward, is not a characteristic of conventional weapons. It is not a characteristic of natural disasters. It is a characteristic of chemical contamination or radiological contamination. At Tal el Hammam, the site was not resettled for approximately 300 years after the destruction event. 3 centuries of abandonment. In a region where Bronze Age settlements were typically reoccupied quickly after conquest or natural disaster, because the agricultural land was valuable and the infrastructure of an existing site made it easier to rebuild than to build from scratch, the 300-year gap at Tal el Hammam is extraordinary. It suggests that the land was not just damaged, but actively hostile to human habitation for an extended period. The physical landscape of the ancient Near East in the 3rd millennium BCE was not the barren, arid region we tend to imagine when we think of the modern Middle East. It was a world of extraordinary agricultural abundance, of rivers running full and regular, of forests covering hillsides that are now desert, of wetlands along the lower Tigris and Euphrates teeming with fish and waterfowl. The Sumerians called their land Kalam, the Black Land, because the soil deposited by seasonal flooding was dark and rich and capable of supporting agricultural yields that, by modern standards, are still impressive. It was this abundance that made the region the cradle of the first urban civilization. Not the ingenuity of the people who lived there, though they were extraordinarily ingenious. The land itself made civilization possible in ways that no other region on Earth at that time could match. And it was this landscape, this specific geography of rivers and plains and the Great Salt Sea that the ancients called the Sea of the Setting Sun, and we call the Dead Sea, that provided the setting for the events we have been examining. The Jordan Valley, where Tal el Hammam sits, was in the Bronze Age one of the most fertile agricultural regions in the ancient Near East. The texts describe it as like the Garden of God, like the land of Egypt before you come to Zor. This was not poetic exaggeration. It was accurate geographic description of a landscape that produced abundant harvests and supported dense human populations and settlements that, by the standards of their era, were genuinely wealthy and sophisticated. The wealth of those settlements is documented in the archaeological record at Tal el Hammam. The excavations have revealed a city of considerable size, with mud brick architecture sophisticated enough to include multi-story buildings, with pottery assemblages indicating long-distance trade connections extending to Egypt, to Cyprus, to Mesopotamia. The city had a defensive perimeter, administrative buildings, what appear to be storage facilities for agricultural surplus. It was, in every material respect, a successful Bronze Age urban center of the kind that the ancient world produced in a handful of locations where the right combination of resources, location, and organizational capacity came together. And then it was gone, in a geological instant. In a destruction event so sudden and so total that the excavators found no evidence of organized retreat, no evidence of the kind of selective salvage that characterizes voluntary abandonment, no evidence of the slow wind down that follows defeat in conventional warfare. The city was there, and then it was not. And where it had been, there was a layer of destruction that contained the physical signatures of temperatures and pressures that should not have been possible in the Bronze Age world. The spherules found at Tal el Hammam are worth dwelling on because they are one of the most specific and diagnostic pieces of physical evidence for the nature of the destruction event. Spherules are tiny glass beads, typically less than a millimeter in diameter, formed when material is heated to temperatures high enough to melt it, and then cooled so rapidly that it solidifies into spherical shapes before it can crystallize. The formation of spherules requires 2 specific conditions: extremely high temperatures in excess of what any conventional fire source can achieve, and extremely rapid cooling, which means the material has been airborne, thrown up into the atmosphere where it cools quickly before settling back to the surface. The only natural processes that produce spherules are volcanic eruptions, lightning strikes affecting a very localized area, and cosmic impact events. The spherule layer at Tal el Hammam is too extensive to be explained by lightning. There is no evidence of volcanic activity in the Jordan Valley region during the relevant time period. That leaves cosmic impact as the explanation the physical evidence most strongly supports. But cosmic impacts do not come with warnings. They do not discriminate between the righteous and the unrighteous. They do not spare specific individuals who have been told in advance to evacuate. They do not generate political deliberation among named authorities before they occur. They are, by definition, random and unmanaged. The spherules confirm that something happened that produced the physical conditions of a cosmic impact event. They do not, by themselves, determine whether that event was natural or artificial. And that is precisely the gap between what the physical evidence can tell us and what the textual evidence addresses. The textual evidence, the Sumerian tablets, fills that gap with specific claims. It says the event was not random, it was deliberate, it was authorized, it was executed using a specific means that the scribes who recorded it described in the best available vocabulary, and it produced consequences that included not just the immediate destruction of the cities, but an extended period of environmental contamination that made the affected area uninhabitable for centuries. Whether the mechanism that produced those consequences was a natural cosmic object, redirected or influenced in some way by the technology the Anunnaki possessed, or an artificial weapon built to produce the same effects as a cosmic impact event, or something else entirely that our current conceptual framework does not have a good category for, is a question the physical evidence cannot answer alone, and the textual evidence describes in terms that are necessarily filtered through the conceptual framework available to a Bronze Age scribe. What we can say honestly is this: the physical evidence confirms a catastrophic high-energy event at Tal el-Hammam, consistent with what the Sumerian texts describe. The Sumerian texts describe that event as deliberate, authorized, and executed by specific named parties for specific stated reasons. The combination of those two facts, physical confirmation of the event and textual description of its deliberate nature, is the strongest evidence we have for taking the ancient Sumerian account seriously as something more than mythology. The additional textual evidence from the lamentation over the destruction of Ur, describing a secondary event consistent with the downwind spread of contamination from the primary destruction site, adds a further dimension that the purely natural airburst explanation struggles to account for. Natural airbursts do not produce downwind death events of the kind described in those lamentations. Weapons that disperse toxic or radioactive material do. The archaeology of the surrounding region adds still more. Multiple sites in the Jordan Valley and the broader Dead Sea area show evidence of abandonment around the same time period. The pattern of abandonment, when mapped geographically, shows a clustering around the area of maximum destruction that is consistent with the population of the surrounding region responding to an event that made that area dangerous to inhabit. People left. They did not come back. Not for 3 centuries. 3 centuries of abandonment in one of the most agriculturally productive regions of the ancient Near East. In a world where Bronze Age settlements were typically reoccupied within a generation of any disturbance that was not permanent. 300 years of empty fields where some of the most fertile soil in the ancient world sat untouched and unfarmed. The land was not just damaged, it was poisoned. In whatever sense a Bronze Age agricultural economy could recognize and respond to environmental poisoning, the population of the ancient Near East recognized that the Jordan Valley was not a place where human beings could safely live for a very long time after the event. And then slowly, over the course of those 300 years, the contamination faded, the land recovered, and people returned. The later archaeological layers at Tal el-Hammam show resettlement, rebuilding, the resumption of agricultural activity. Life went on. But the memory of what had happened, preserved in the religious and literary traditions of every civilization in the region, never faded. The story of the cities destroyed by fire from above, of the fertile plain becoming a desolation, of the salt and the smoke and the darkness, persisted in the cultural memory of the ancient Near East for thousands of years, and eventually found its most enduring form in the pages of the Hebrew Bible. That persistence of memory is itself a form of evidence. Human cultures forget things. They forget the details of battles and famines and floods. They forget the names of kings and the locations of cities. The things they remember across thousands of years, the things they encode in their most sacred texts and repeat in their most important rituals, are the things that shaped them so profoundly that the memory could not be lost even when everything else was. The destruction of the cities of the plain shaped the cultures of the ancient Near East in exactly that way. It is not just in the Hebrew Bible. It is in the Sumerian Lamentations. It is in the Akkadian texts. It is in references scattered through the Ugaritic literature, the Canaanite religious texts, that give us another independent window into the cultural memory of the ancient Levant. The same event, described from different angles in different literary traditions, by different civilizations that had no reason to coordinate their accounts, consistently describes a catastrophe of fire and destruction in a specific geographic region that matches the physical evidence from the archaeological record. The convergence of independent literary traditions, physical evidence, and the oldest written records on Earth on a single event in a single location is not something that can be explained away as coincidence or as the cross-contamination of mythological traditions. It is the signature of a real event, documented by multiple witnesses in multiple ways, preserved by multiple cultures because the event was too important and too traumatic to be forgotten. The Sumerians, who were closest to the events in both time and geographical proximity, gave us the most detailed account. The account names the agents, it describes the deliberation, it records the weapon, it describes the aftermath, and it does all of this in the precise, institutional, administratively detailed style that characterized Sumerian record-keeping at its best, a style that was not applied to fictional events, but to real ones. The clay tablets are the primary source. The physical evidence is the confirmation. And the convergence of every independent line of inquiry on the same conclusion is the verification. The fire that fell on those two cities more than 4,000 years ago in the fertile plain of the Jordan Valley was the most documented catastrophe of the ancient world. Documented in clay, documented in stone, documented in the geological record of the earth itself. And the documentation, taken together and read honestly, describes not a myth and not a natural disaster misunderstood by primitive minds, but a specific event with specific agents and specific consequences that shape the entire subsequent history of human civilization. That is what the Sumerian tablet says. That is what the tablet said 2,000 years before. The Bible encoded the same event in different language for different purposes. And that is what the physical evidence from Tal el-Hammam confirms, in the language of spherules, and shocked quartz, and melted mud brick, and 3 centuries of empty fields, for anyone willing to read it. The oldest written records we have, the physical evidence under our feet, the memory preserved in the sacred texts of 3 of the world's great religions, all pointing in the same direction, all describing the same event, all waiting for the same honest acknowledgement. The fire was real. The tablet that described it was pressed in clay before the Bible was written. And the question of what sent that fire and why and what it means for our understanding of who we are and where we came from is the most important question our civilization has not yet found the courage to ask out loud. The tablets are asking it for us. They have been asking it for 5,000 years. And the clay, unlike the institutions that have chosen to ignore it, is very patient. The 2021 Nature paper, written by a team of mainstream scientists who were absolutely not interested in validating ancient astronaut theory, concluded that the evidence was consistent with a cosmic airburst event. They did not offer an explanation for the 300-year abandonment period beyond the trauma of the event and the loss of population. But the abandonment period is there. The data is there. And the Sumerian texts, written 2,000 years before the site was abandoned, describe the same extended desolation in terms that suggest it was expected, that it was a known characteristic of the weapon used, that the Anunnaki who authorized the destruction understood that they were creating not just a one-time catastrophe, but a long-term environmental consequence. That is not what you expect if you are describing oral tradition, preserving the memory of a random asteroid. That is what you expect if you are describing a weapon with known properties deployed deliberately with full knowledge of what the aftermath would look like. We are going to spend the next section of this documentary following the evidence for the Anunnaki hierarchy specifically, looking at what the texts say about their physical characteristics, their technology, their organizational structure, and the specific events in Sumerian history that led up to the destruction of the cities. Because understanding what came before the destruction is essential to understanding why it happened, and understanding why it happened is essential to understanding the full scope of what we are actually dealing with when we read these ancient texts. Because the destruction of the cities of the plain was not the beginning of the Anunnaki story. It was not even close to the beginning. It was an event that occurred after thousands of years of Anunnaki presence on Earth, after the creation of humanity, after the establishment and collapse of multiple civilizations, after the Great Flood that the Sumerian texts describe as an earlier attempt at total elimination of the human population, and after a long series of internal conflicts within the Anunnaki hierarchy that the texts describe with what, by any reasonable assessment, is a remarkable level of political and institutional detail. The oldest Sumerian king lists documents that record the names and reign lengths of pre-flood and post-flood kings begin with a statement that has been translated as kingship descended from heaven. This is not a metaphor in the conventional religious sense. In the Sumerian worldview, kingship was not a human institution that was later sanctified by divine approval. Kingship was an Anunnaki institution that was given to humanity from above, complete with the full set of organizing principles, technologies, and social structures required to make it function. The first cities were not built by humans working their way up from hunter-gatherer societies through their own independent ingenuity. They were established according to a template that came from above, and they were maintained and overseen by Anunnaki representatives who are named in the texts and who are described as having lived in those cities and having direct administrative roles in their governance. This is an extraordinary claim. It is the kind of claim that mainstream archaeology and mainstream ancient history will not engage with directly, because engaging with it seriously would require dismantling enormous amounts of established scholarly consensus about the nature of the first human civilizations. The consensus says that Sumerian civilization arose through an internal process of social development, that the first cities were built by humans responding to the agricultural potential of the Tigris-Euphrates river valley, that the gods described in Sumerian texts are theological inventions created by the human mind to explain natural forces and to organize social behavior. That is the consensus. And anyone who challenges it within the academic establishment faces serious professional consequences. But the texts themselves say something different. And when you read those texts carefully, when you notice the consistency of the organizational detail across thousands of years and hundreds of independent documents, when you take seriously the fact that the people who wrote these texts were not primitive myth makers, but the most sophisticated scribal culture that had ever existed up to that point in human history, the dismissive mythology explanation starts to feel less like scholarship and more like institutional self-protection. The Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki as having specific physical characteristics. They are described as tall, consistently taller than the humans around them. They are described as having a radiance or brightness associated with them that the texts sometimes describe as a divine glow, and that other contexts suggest might be related to something they wear or carry, rather than an intrinsic quality of their bodies. They are described as enormously long-lived, with individual Anunnaki appearing across texts that span hundreds of years of human time without any indication that those individuals have aged. They are described as eating and drinking, as having physical needs and physical pleasures, as being capable of illness and injury, as being mortal in the sense that they can be killed under the right circumstances, but as possessing a natural lifespan so long that from a human perspective, they appear effectively immortal. They are described as using flying vehicles. Multiple Sumerian texts describe Anunnaki beings traveling in what the texts call a mu, or sometimes a shem, a term that modern translators render variously as name, fame, vehicle, or the shining thing, depending on context. The inconsistency of translations for this term reflects genuine scholarly difficulty with a word that seems to describe something the scribes who wrote it had witnessed, but did not have an established vocabulary to describe with precision. The contexts in which the Mu or Shem appears in the text are consistently contexts of aerial travel, of descending from above, of ascending rapidly into the sky, of traversing great distances in short periods of time. Sumerian temples, the ziggurat complexes that were the dominant architectural form of the ancient Near East for 2,000 years, are described in the texts as the dwelling places of the Anunnaki on Earth. But their function is not simply religious in the way we understand a temple. The texts describe the inner sanctums of these structures as places where specific Anunnaki beings actually lived, where they received the material offerings of food and drink that human priests brought to them daily, where their physical presence was a regular and expected feature of the operation of the city. The god was not an idea worshipped in the temple. The god was a being who actually lived in the temple and who could be encountered physically by priests with authorized access. The distinction is significant because it changes the entire framework for understanding what these civilizations believed and what their relationship with the divine actually was. Modern religious traditions, whether monotheistic or polytheistic, understand the relationship between humans and gods as fundamentally asymmetrical, with the divine being categorically different from the human, present to humans through faith and ritual rather than through direct physical contact. The Sumerian tradition describes something entirely different, a relationship between humans and Anunnaki that is more like the relationship between a local population and a ruling class that happens to be physically present in the city, capable of direct interaction with authorized humans, capable of giving direct commands, capable of providing direct material benefits, and capable of direct physical violence against those who violate their authority. That is not theology. That is political science applied to beings with extraordinary capabilities. And it is that relationship, that specific, detailed, politically organized relationship between the Anunnaki and the human populations they governed, that provides the context for the destruction of the cities. Because the cities of the plain did not just violate a moral code, they violated a political code. They challenged an established hierarchy. They threatened the established order of a civilization that had been organized from the top down by the Anunnaki for purposes that served the Anunnaki's interests and that depended for its stability on human populations, remaining within the boundaries that the Anunnaki had set for them. When those boundaries were crossed, the response was not divine wrath in the theological sense. It was executive action by an authority that had both the capability and the established precedent to use extreme force when it judged the situation to require it. Understanding who made that judgment, on what basis they made it, and what the internal politics of the Anunnaki hierarchy looked like at the time of the destruction is the key to understanding why those specific cities in that specific region at that specific moment in history were targeted for elimination. And that understanding requires us to go deeper into the specific individuals named in the text, their relationships with one another, their competing interests, and the specific chain of events that led from the establishment of the cities to their destruction. That is where we are going next. Into the court of the Anunnaki, into the politics of beings who are described as gods but who behave, in the detailed record of the Sumerian texts, with all the ambition, calculation, pride, and ruthlessness of any ruling class in any civilization that has ever existed. The Anunnaki hierarchy, as described across the full sweep of Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian literature, is a remarkably coherent political structure. It has a supreme authority, subordinate regional authorities, a defined chain of command for major decisions, and a system of law and precedent that constrains the actions even of the most powerful individuals within it. It is not a vague pantheon of interchangeable divine forces. It is a specific organization with specific members, specific territories, specific responsibilities, and specific relationships of power and obligation that persist across thousands of years of textual record. At the top is Anu. His seat of authority is described as being in the sky, in what the texts call the Great Above, and his role is that of a supreme ruler whose authority is beyond challenge, but who rarely involves himself directly in earthly affairs. He delegates, he authorizes, he adjudicates disputes between subordinates. But the day-to-day governance of Earth and its human population is handled by his two sons. Enlil holds authority over the Earth itself, over the air, over the storms, and over the human populations of the land. His seat of earthly authority is the city of Nippur, which was the religious center of the Sumerian world, and which is described in the texts as the location of the Anunnaki Council, the Dur-dat-Enki, the bond between heaven and earth, the place where earthly and heavenly authority intersect. Enlil's character, as it emerges across hundreds of texts, is that of a powerful, principled, and deeply conservative authority figure who views the maintenance of established order as the highest value, and who responds to threats to that order with swift and overwhelming force. Enki holds authority over the deep waters, over the Abzu, over wisdom and knowledge and technology, and over a southern region of the earth that the texts associate with what we would now call the Persian Gulf and the surrounding area. His seat is the city of Eridu, which is described in the Sumerian texts as the oldest city on earth, the first city established by the Anunnaki, the place where civilization began. Enki's character is the counterpoint to Enlil's. He is creative, flexible, willing to bend rules in service of larger goals, prone to deception when direct authority would be refused, and deeply attached to humanity in a way that Enlil is not. The Sumerian texts describe Enki as the being who, more than any other Anunnaki, advocated for humanity's interests within the hierarchy. The relationship between Enlil and Enki is the central dynamic that drives the major events of Sumerian mythology, and it is a relationship defined by a fundamental political conflict that goes back to the beginning of Anunnaki presence on Earth. Enlil is the legitimate heir, the son of Anu by his primary consort, the holder of inherited authority. But Enki is described as the more capable son, the more intelligent son, the one whose knowledge and creativity give him a practical advantage even when he lacks the formal authority. Their conflict is not simple good versus evil. It is not the case that one of them is right and the other is wrong. It is the case that two intelligent, capable beings with genuinely different values and different visions for how earthly civilization should be organized have been forced to share authority over the same territory and the same subject population for a very long time, and that tension between them is the engine that drives the narrative. In the specific context of the destruction of the cities, this conflict reaches one of its most dramatic expressions, because the decision to destroy the cities is Enlil's decision, made through the proper channels of Anunnaki authority, with the support of the majority of the council. And Enki's opposition to it, his attempt to mitigate the decision, his warning to at least one individual to flee before the destruction came, is exactly the kind of thing Enki does throughout the Sumerian literary tradition. He cannot stop the authorized use of force, but he can, and does, find ways to ensure that not everyone dies. The individual Enki warns in the destruction narrative is the Sumerian equivalent of the biblical Lot. The texts are not entirely consistent about his identity across all sources, but the pattern is consistent. A righteous man, someone in good standing with the Anunnaki, and specifically with Enki, is warned in advance, told to leave the targeted cities before the destruction, and survives along with his family. His wife, in some versions of the story, does not follow the instruction she was given about not looking back. And her death is described in terms that, in the context of a radiological or chemical event, make a certain grim sense. The instruction not to look back is puzzling if you read it as purely moral instruction, as the Bible eventually frames it. Why would looking back at a burning city be a sin deserving death? But in the context of a high-energy weapon event, in the context of a blast that produces an intense thermal pulse, followed by a rapidly expanding pressure wave, followed by a debris field raining burning material, the instruction not to look back is safety instruction. You do not look back because the thermal pulse from the explosion, even at a distance, can cause eye damage. You do not look back because slowing down in proximity to the event means you are still in the danger zone. You do not look back because the instinct to look is natural and the Anunnaki have evidently learned from previous use of this weapon that it needs to be explicitly overridden. And in the biblical account, Lot's wife looks back, and she becomes a pillar of salt. In the context of a weapon that causes instantaneous death and possibly leaves a residue of salt from the vaporization of the Dead Sea water. In the context of a body that is suddenly killed and remains standing in the position it was in at the moment of death, the phrase pillar of salt takes on a different quality. It is no longer metaphor. It is description. The third member of the Anunnaki triad, most directly involved in the events surrounding the destruction, is a being named Nana, also known as Sin, the Anunnaki, associated with the moon and specifically associated with the city of Ur. Nana Sin is relevant to this story because the destruction of the cities of the plain in the Sumerian texts is followed almost immediately by a related but distinct catastrophe, the destruction of the city of Ur itself, and the texts dealing with the destruction of Ur are in some ways even more specific about the nature of the weapon used than the texts dealing with the cities of the plain. The lamentation over the destruction of Ur, one of the most extensively studied of all Sumerian literary texts, describes Ur being destroyed by what it calls an evil wind, a wind that came from a specific direction, that killed everything in its path, that could not be stopped by walls or doors or any physical barrier, that left the land desolate and its people dead. The text is a formal lamentation written from the perspective of Nana Sin, mourning the destruction of his city, and it is addressed partly to Enlil, implicitly asking why this judgment was necessary and why it was so total. The characteristics of the evil wind described in the lamentation over the destruction of Ur are worth examining carefully. The wind comes from a specific direction, which in the text is described as coming from the west, from the direction of the cities of the plain. It moves across the landscape like a weather phenomenon, but kills like a weapon. It cannot be escaped by hiding indoors. It affects animals as well as people. It leaves the land desolate afterward in a way that suggests not just physical destruction, but some kind of contamination. Modern readers familiar with radiological events will recognize this description. A cloud of radioactive fallout carried by wind from an initial detonation site to downwind locations would match the description of an evil wind from a specific direction. It would kill people indoors as well as outdoors. It would affect animals. It would leave the affected area contaminated and unable to support normal habitation for an extended period. And the detonation site of a nuclear or radiological weapon would itself show the kind of total destruction, the melted rock, the vitrified soil, the structural collapse, the absence of organic material that we see in the destruction layer at Tal El Hammam. The distance from the Jordan Valley, where the physical destruction evidence is concentrated, to the city of Ur, which is located in southern Mesopotamia, near the Persian Gulf, is approximately 1,000 kilometers. That is a long way for fallout to travel. But major nuclear events in the 20th century produced fallout that traveled comparable distances and caused documented deaths and illness far from the initial detonation site. The wind patterns in the ancient Near East, driven by the same regional pressure systems that drive them today, would have carried material from a Jordan Valley event northward and eastward toward Mesopotamia. This is speculative. It is important to be honest about that. The connection between the destruction at Tal El Hammam and the destruction of Ur is speculative, because the dating of the events is not precise enough to establish whether they were truly simultaneous or whether they occurred decades or even centuries apart. The Sumerian literary tradition presents them as connected events, as part of the same catastrophe authorized by the same authority for related reasons. But literary tradition is not archaeology, and the archaeological evidence for the dating of these events is still being refined. What is not speculative is the content of the texts themselves. The Sumerian texts, written by the most sophisticated scribal culture of the ancient world, describe a weapon used against multiple cities in the ancient Near East, authorized by a specific authority within a specific hierarchical structure, with specific physical characteristics, including an evil wind that kills indiscriminately and leaves the land desolate. The physical evidence at Tal el-Hammam confirms that something of extraordinary violence happened at that location, something involving temperatures and energies that go far beyond conventional fire or conventional military destruction. And the site was abandoned for approximately 300 years afterward. The mainstream scientific explanation is a cosmic airburst, a natural event. The mainstream scholarly explanation for the Sumerian texts is mythology, a cultural elaboration. Both explanations are possible. Neither explanation is without problems, and neither explanation, individually or together, fully accounts for all the evidence. The cosmic airburst explanation does not account for the selectivity of the destruction, the survival of specific individuals warned in advance, the political deliberation described in the texts, or the weapon characteristics described as an evil wind from a specific direction affecting downwind locations. The mythology explanation does not account for the level of specific operational detail in the texts, the consistency of that detail across independent sources, or the physical evidence at Tal el-Hammam that matches the described destruction with uncomfortable precision. The explanation that accounts for all the evidence, the explanation that requires the fewest additional assumptions once you take the primary sources seriously, is the one that the ancient Sumerians themselves offered, that beings with advanced technology, beings who came from above, beings who had established and governed human civilization on Earth for thousands of years, made a political decision to destroy specific cities using a weapon with specific characteristics, and that those events were witnessed and recorded by the most literate civilization in the ancient world, in documents that have now been translated and can be read by anyone willing to read them without the predetermined conclusion that mythology must be the only explanation. The next piece of evidence we need to examine is the geological and archaeological record from the broader region. The evidence that supports the conclusion that something extraordinary happened across the ancient Near East approximately 4,000 years ago, not just at one site, but across multiple sites, not just in one moment, but across a period that corresponds to what ancient texts from multiple civilizations describe as a catastrophic end of an entire age of human civilization. Because the destruction of the cities of the plain did not happen in isolation. It happened at the end of a period that modern archaeologists call the early Bronze Age collapse, a dramatic and still not fully explained decline and abandonment of major urban centers across the ancient Near East that occurred between approximately 2200 and 2000 our size, BCE, give or take a few centuries, depending on which sites you are looking at and which dating methods you are using. The early Bronze Age collapse is one of the great mysteries of ancient history. Multiple major urban centers, cities that had thrived for centuries, that had populations of tens of thousands of people, that had developed sophisticated trade networks, legal systems, agricultural technologies, and literary traditions, were abandoned within a relatively short period. The populations dispersed. The irrigation systems were neglected and failed. The writing traditions that had been maintained by professional scribal classes disappeared or went dormant for centuries. The long-distance trade networks that had connected the ancient Near East with Egypt, with the Indus Valley, with the Mediterranean coast, collapsed. Mainstream archaeologists debate the causes. Climate change is frequently invoked, specifically a prolonged drought that some paleoclimatological evidence suggests affected the ancient Near East around 2200 BCE. Invasion by outside groups, called variously the Gudians or the Amorites depending on the region, is also cited. Internal economic and social stresses are proposed. The consensus view is that the collapse was the result of multiple interacting factors, a perfect storm of environmental, economic, and political pressures that overwhelmed civilizations that had become too complex and too interdependent to survive such simultaneous stresses. This is a reasonable explanation. It is the kind of explanation that emerges naturally from a discipline that prefers systemic causes to dramatic single events. And it may well be partially correct. Climate change almost certainly played a role. Political instability certainly played a role. Economic stress certainly played a role. But there is a problem with the purely systemic explanation, and the problem is the speed of the collapse at specific sites. Because at some of the sites that show destruction layers from this period, the collapse is not gradual. It is not the kind of decline that you see from drought and economic stress, where populations dwindle over decades, where cities are slowly abandoned as their agricultural hinterlands fail, where there is time for people to take their belongings and their memories and move on. At some sites, the collapse is sudden, violent, complete. The kind of collapse that leaves a destruction layer you can date to within a narrow time range, that leaves bodies where they fell, that leaves valuables and tools and food stores where they were placed, that leaves evidence of a population that did not have the time or the warning to pack up and move on. Those sites, the ones with the sudden violent destruction layers, the ones where the evidence looks less like gradual decline and more like something ending in a moment, are the sites that deserve the most attention. Because those are the sites that the systemic explanation struggles with most. Climate change does not produce sudden destruction layers, economic stress does not leave bodies where they fell, and valuables untouched in a burning building. Something else does. The distribution of those violent destruction layers across the ancient Near East during the early Bronze Age collapse period is not random. They cluster in the Levant, in the Jordan Valley, and the Dead Sea region, in a pattern that is consistent with a single high-energy event, affecting a wide area rather than with multiple independent military attacks or natural disasters occurring simultaneously. And the time frame of that distribution, when correlated with the absolute dates available from radiocarbon dating and from pottery typology, overlaps with the time frame given in the Sumerian texts for the destruction of the cities of the plain. None of this proves the ancient astronaut hypothesis. None of it proves that a non-human civilization used advanced weapons against Bronze Age cities. Proof is too strong a word for what the current evidence can support. But it does suggest, strongly, that something extraordinary happened in the ancient Near East around 4,000 years ago. Something that was remembered across multiple civilizations, encoded in multiple literary traditions, preserved in the oldest written records on Earth, and confirmed at least one specific site by physical evidence of a violence and totality that exceed anything conventional explanations can fully account for. The Sumerians knew what happened. They wrote it down. They wrote it down in the most precise language available to them, in a writing system they had developed specifically because they understood the value of preserving accurate records in documents that they copied and recopied and preserved across centuries, because they understood that these records described events of supreme historical importance. And then history buried those records under 5,000 years of sediment and political change and cultural catastrophe. And when they were dug up again in the 19th century by European archaeologists who were primarily interested in confirming the biblical narrative, they were categorized as mythology and filed away in museums where most of them remain to this day. Translated but not believed, available but not taken seriously. We are at a moment when that is beginning to change. The evidence from Tal el-Hammam, published in a mainstream scientific journal in 2021, was the first time in more than a century of modern archaeology that the physical evidence of the destruction of the cities of the plain was taken seriously enough to be subjected to rigorous scientific analysis. The results of that analysis confirmed what the ancient texts had been saying all along. Something extraordinary happened there. Something violent, sudden, and total. Something that left physical traces that matched the literary descriptions in remarkable detail. The question that Tal el-Hammam cannot answer, the question that no amount of archaeological excavation will by itself answer, is the question of agency. Was this a natural disaster? Terrible but random? Or was it deliberate, authorized, executed by beings with specific intentions against a specific population for specific reasons? The Sumerian texts answer that question, unambiguously, with names, with organizational details, with accounts of deliberation and decision-making, with descriptions of the weapon and its deployment, with records of the warning given to survivors. The question is whether we are willing to take the oldest written records on Earth seriously enough to believe what they say. The evidence says we should. The physical evidence, the literary evidence, the archaeological evidence, the geological evidence all point in the same direction, toward an event of extraordinary violence, of deliberate targeting, of selective survival, that matches the Sumerian account with a precision that cannot be explained away as coincidence. And if that is true, if the Sumerians were recording history rather than myth when they described the Anunnaki and their weapons, then the implications extend far beyond the destruction of two cities in the ancient Near East. They extend to the entire history of human civilization as we understand it, to the question of where that civilization came from, who established it, and for what purpose, to the question of what we are as a species and where we actually came from. Because if the Anunnaki were real, and if they created humanity, and if they governed human civilization for thousands of years, and if they destroyed specific human settlements when those settlements became too capable or too autonomous for the Anunnaki's comfort, then the history of humanity is not the history of an independently developing species working its way up from primitive beginnings through its own ingenuity and effort. It is the history of a managed population created and maintained by an outside authority for purposes that authority defined, and occasionally culled when it grew beyond the boundaries that authority had established. That is a deeply uncomfortable conclusion. It challenges everything we believe about human agency, about human development, about the meaning of human civilization. It challenges the religious traditions that describe a single, transcendent, divine authority who created humanity in love. It challenges the secular scientific tradition that describes humanity as a naturally evolved species whose development followed no plan and served no external purpose. But it is the conclusion that the oldest written records on Earth point toward. And those records, the tablets of ancient Sumer, were written by people who had far less reason to mythologize or distort the events they were describing than we have to dismiss those descriptions as myth. They were there, we were not. And they wrote down what they saw. Now let us examine the specific Sumerian texts that deal with the period immediately before the destruction of the cities. The texts that describe the political situation among the Anunnaki and among the human civilizations they governed. The texts that explain why the destruction happened when it did and why it targeted the specific cities it targeted. Because this context is essential. The destruction did not come out of nowhere. It was the culmination of a specific political and military crisis within the Anunnaki hierarchy. A crisis that involved not just Enlil and Enki, but several other major Anunnaki figures whose stories intersect at the moment of the destruction in ways that the texts describe with remarkable specificity. The political crisis that preceded the destruction of the cities is described most fully in a cycle of texts that scholars call the Inanna Ishtar texts, named for the Anunnaki figure who is central to them. Inanna, known also by the Akkadian name Ishtar, is described in the Sumerian texts as the granddaughter of Enlil, a being of extraordinary capability and ambition who does not accept the subordinate role that her position in the hierarchy technically assigns to her. She is the goddess of love and war, a pairing that seems contradictory to modern minds, but that in the Sumerian understanding reflects a coherent worldview in which the desire to possess and the willingness to destroy are aspects of the same fundamental drive. Inanna's role in the events leading to the destruction of the cities involves a long and complex political struggle for control of specific territories and specific me, the divine laws and objects that encode authority in the Sumerian worldview. She is described as having acquired me through various means, some authorized and some not, and as having used those me to establish herself as a power within the Anunnaki hierarchy that exceeded what her formal position would have allowed. She is associated with specific cities, with specific trade routes, with specific human populations that she governs directly, and her political ambitions are described as having created conflicts with other Anunnaki, whose territories and interests she threatened. The cities of the plain are associated in some of the texts with a region that was contested between different Anunnaki factions. the fertility and strategic location of the Jordan Valley, its position as a crossroads between Egypt and Mesopotamia, between the coast and the interior, made it valuable territory that multiple Anunnaki figures wanted to control. And the human populations of that region, benefiting from the prosperity and the accumulation of knowledge that their position gave them, had developed capabilities that some of those Anunnaki figures found threatening. There is also in the texts a figure named Marduk, the son of Enki, who is associated with Babylon and who in the later Akkadian and Babylonian traditions becomes the supreme deity of the Mesopotamian world, supplanting even Enlil and Anu in the religious hierarchy. Marduk's rise in the texts is described as a long political struggle that involves conflict with other Anunnaki, exile, return, and eventually a kind of political triumph that the Babylonian texts frame as theological, but that, read through the lens of the Sumerian political tradition, looks more like a successful bid for supreme earthly authority. Marduk's involvement in the events surrounding the destruction of the cities is described in texts that are among the most dramatic and specific in the entire Sumerian Akkadian literary tradition. He is associated with a struggle for control of the same territories that are targeted for destruction, and the Anunnaki, who wield the weapon of destruction in some versions of the story, are acting partly to prevent Marduk from consolidating control over those territories. The destruction of the cities in this reading is not just a punishment of human populations. It is a political and military action within the Anunnaki hierarchy itself, with the human cities as the collateral of a much larger conflict. This reading is supported by what happens immediately after the destruction in the textual record. Marduk is described as being exiled, forced to leave his city, wandering without a home. The weapon used to destroy the cities, the evil wind that the texts describe as moving from the site of destruction toward Mesopotamia, causes damage in the Anunnaki's own cities, as well as in the human settlements it passes through. There is a sense in the texts that the weapon that was used was destructive on a scale that even its wielders had not fully anticipated, that it caused consequences they had not intended, and that the aftermath was sufficiently terrible that even the authority who authorized it found the results uncomfortable. This is consistent with what we know about weapons of mass destruction from our own history. They tend to have consequences beyond what their users anticipate. They tend to contaminate the political and physical environment in ways that outlast the immediate military objective. They tend to be, once used, a demonstration of a capability that changes everything about how every other party in the conflict calculates their own position. The use of the weapon against the cities of the plain, whatever that weapon actually was, changed the political situation among the Anunnaki in ways that the texts describe as permanent. The period following the destruction is described as a time of mourning, of recrimination, of lasting consequences that none of the parties involved had fully intended. And the human civilizations of the ancient Near East entered a dark period, a period of instability and collapse and abandonment, that the archaeological record confirms with remarkable consistency. The early Bronze Age collapse is real. The sudden abandonment of major urban centers is real. The disruption of trade networks, the failure of agricultural systems, the decline of scribal culture, the disappearance of centralized authority across the ancient Near East, these are all documented in the archaeological record, and they all happen within a time frame that overlaps with the period described in the Sumerian texts as the aftermath of the destruction of the cities. The mainstream explanation is systemic. Multiple interacting causes: climate change, political stress, economic collapse. The Sumerian explanation is specific. A weapon was used. Cities were destroyed. The weapon's consequences spread beyond the intended target. Civilizations collapsed. Both explanations are consistent with the evidence, but the Sumerian explanation has the advantage of being the account of people who were there. As we move toward the final section of this documentary, we need to address the most important question. Not what happened, but what it means. What does it mean for our understanding of human history if the ancient Sumerians were recording something real when they described the Anunnaki? What does it mean for our understanding of the present if the beings they described were not myths, but historical realities. Because if the Anunnaki were real, they have not been heard from in any explicit way for approximately 4,000 years. The last period in the Sumerian textual record when the Anunnaki are described as directly and actively governing human affairs is precisely the period we have been discussing, the period that ends with the destruction of the cities and the collapse of the early Bronze Age. After that, the Anunnaki appear in religious literature as remote divine figures, worshipped but not encountered, invoked but not present, remembered but not experienced. Something changed 4,000 years ago. Something ended. The direct, active, governing presence of the Anunnaki in human civilization, as described in the Sumerian texts, came to an end at exactly the same time as the destruction of the cities and the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations. Was that a coincidence? Was the withdrawal of Anunnaki direct governance simply part of the natural evolution of human civilization, a development that the destruction of the cities was incidentally concurrent with? Or was the destruction of the cities itself the event that ended direct Anunnaki governance, either because the weapon's consequences were too severe for even the Anunnaki to remain in the affected area, or because the political crisis within the Anunnaki hierarchy that produced the destruction also produced a crisis severe enough that they withdrew from direct earthly governance? The texts do not answer this question directly. The Sumerian literary tradition ends with the collapse of the civilization that produced it. The Babylonian texts that follow are more theological and less historical than their Sumerian predecessors, more concerned with the mythological dimensions of the Anunnaki stories, and less concerned with the operational political details that characterize the earlier Sumerian documents. The transition from history to mythology, from records of events to ritual narratives, happens precisely at the end of the period we have been discussing. That transition itself is evidence of something. Civilizations do not voluntarily abandon accurate historical records in favor of mythological elaborations unless something has disrupted the tradition that produced those records. The Sumerian scribal tradition was extremely conservative. Scribes were trained over years to copy texts exactly, to preserve the vocabulary and grammar of earlier periods even when those periods were centuries removed. The texts were not changed because scribes found mythology more aesthetically satisfying than history. They changed because the civilization that produced the history was gone. And it was gone because of the events we have been describing. The last thing we want to examine is the trail of these stories through subsequent cultures, because the pattern is too consistent to be coincidental. The story of the Anunnaki and their weapons, the story of beings from above who created humanity and governed it and occasionally destroyed parts of it, does not disappear with the end of Sumerian civilization. It persists, it evolves, it gets encoded in new forms and new languages and new theological frameworks, but the core elements remain. In the Hebrew Bible, the Anunnaki become the Elohim, a Hebrew plural that is usually translated as God, but which linguistically is more accurately translated as gods, plural. The creation narrative in Genesis preserves elements of the Sumerian creation story in forms that are recognizably related but stripped of the operational detail that characterizes the Sumerian originals. The beings who created humanity are still multiple. The process of creation still involves a kind of clay or earth material being combined with the divine element. The concern about human capability getting out of hand, expressed in Sumerian texts as the Anunnaki debate, finds its expression in Genesis in God's statement after the Tower of Babel, that humanity, if left unchecked, will be able to do anything it imagines. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah preserves the core elements of the Sumerian destruction narrative. Fire from the sky, 2 cities, total destruction, a righteous man warned in advance, a wife who looks back and dies, salt. But the Hebrew tradition strips away the political context, the Anunnaki hierarchy, the specific beings who authorized and deployed the weapon, the internal debate, and the dissenting voice. It replaces that political context with a theological framework in which a single omnipotent God acts in response to moral transgression. The event is reframed from a political military action by a specific authority within a specific hierarchy to a divine judgment executed by an all-powerful being in response to sin. This reframing was not arbitrary or dishonest. It was the natural result of a different civilization's encounter with the same tradition, processed through a different theological framework and encoded in a different literary form. The Hebrews were not lying about what happened. They were telling the story of the same events through the lens of their own understanding, which included a theology that did not recognize the Anunnaki hierarchy as a political structure, but understood the divine as a single omnipotent authority. The same pattern appears in the Vedic texts of ancient India, which preserve descriptions of flying vehicles called vimanas and of weapons called the Brahmastra that are described as capable of total destruction and as leaving behind a residue that causes lasting harm. The Vedic texts describe battles between divine beings using these weapons, battles that destroy cities and alter landscapes, that are described with enough operational specificity to suggest they are not purely mythological inventions. The same pattern appears in the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, the great Sanskrit epics of ancient India, which contain descriptions of aerial warfare, of energy weapons, of destruction of cities from above, that are embedded in narrative frameworks that the modern mind classifies as mythology, but that the ancient Indian tradition understood as history. The same pattern appears in Chinese texts from the earliest dynasties, in the tradition of the Yellow Emperor and his conflict with opponents who used flying vehicles and energy weapons, in ancient Mesoamerican traditions, in ancient Egyptian texts, in the oldest layers of Mesopotamian religion that predate even the Sumerians. Every civilization that preserved records from the deep past has some version of the same story. Beings from above, advanced technology, the creation of humanity, the governance of human civilization, the eventual crisis and withdrawal. The memory preserved in religious and mythological tradition of beings who were not gods in the theological sense, but who possessed capabilities so far beyond human experience that the distinction between God and advanced alien would not have been meaningful to the people who encountered them. This consistency across cultures, across continents, across thousands of years of independent development is the most significant evidence of all, because it means that the core of the Sumerian record is not a local tradition invented by one civilization in one place. It is a global memory of real events, preserved in the cultural DNA of every civilization that maintained records of the deep past. The question of what the Anunnaki actually were, extraterrestrial visitors, a pre-human terrestrial civilization, trans-dimensional beings, some other category that our current conceptual framework does not have a word for, that question is genuinely open. The Sumerian texts describe them as coming from the sky, from the heavens, from above. They describe them as having come to Earth from somewhere else. But they do not describe them in terms that allow us to determine, from our current vantage point, whether that somewhere else was another planet, another dimension, another era of Earth's own history, or something else entirely. What the texts do not leave open to question is whether these beings existed and whether they acted in the world in the ways described. The specificity of the Sumerian record, the coherence of the Akkadian and Babylonian traditions that follow it, the physical evidence that confirms at least some of the events the texts describe, and the global consistency of related traditions across cultures that had no contact with ancient Sumer, all point toward the conclusion that the Sumerians were recording something real. The fire that fell on the cities of the plain was real. The tablet that described it, pressed into clay 2,000 years before the Hebrew Bible encoded the same event in its own tradition, is sitting in the British Museum right now. The physical evidence of that event is in the soil at Tal el Hammam, measurable and documented and confirmed by mainstream science. And the beings described as having authorized and deployed the weapon that caused that event are named in that clay tablet and in hundreds of other tablets, described with organizational and operational detail that is not consistent with mythology whose stories were important enough to be preserved by the most literate civilization in human history as core documents of their understanding of reality. The history of humanity is not what we think it is. The oldest records we have, the ones written by the people closest to the events they describe, tell a different story, a story of beings from above who shaped human civilization for their own purposes, a story of fire falling from the sky as an act of deliberate destruction, a story of survival and warning and salt and desolation, a story that has been encoded in the religious and mythological traditions of every civilization on Earth for thousands of years. Because it happened. And because what happened to humanity in the ancient past is too important to be forgotten, even when the civilization that first recorded it is gone. The tablets are there. The evidence is there. The trail is there for anyone willing to follow it honestly. The question is what we do with what we find when we get to the end of that trail. Because the end of the trail does not lead to comfortable conclusions. It leads to a world in which humanity is not what we thought it was, in which our history is not what we were taught, and in which the beings who shape that history may not be as absent from our present as we have assumed. The fire fell on those cities more than 4,000 years ago. The clay tablet that recorded it was pressed before Abraham was born. And the evidence of that fire is still in the ground, still measurable, still waiting for anyone with the courage to look at it honestly and accept what it means. We have been looking away for long enough. The tablets of ancient Sumer are not mythology. They are history. The oldest history we have. And the story they tell, the story of the Anunnaki and their weapons and their decisions and their humanity, is not over. It is the story we are still living inside of, whether we know it or not. The fire that fell on those two cities is the oldest human memory we can read. And what it remembers is not divine wrath in the theological sense. It is something that happened, something real, something witnessed by human beings who understood, even if they could not articulate it in terms a modern scientist would accept, that the fire did not come from nowhere, that it did not arrive by accident, that it was sent by beings who had the capability to send it and the authority to authorize its use, and the reasons, however we may judge those reasons, to believe the destruction was necessary. They wrote it down, in clay, in a language 5,000 years old. And the clay survived. And the language was deciphered, and the words are there, available, waiting to be read by anyone who is willing to set aside what they were told history looks like and look honestly at what the oldest history we have actually says. This is what it says. The fire was real. The beings who sent it were real. And the world we live in today was shaped by what they did 4,000 years ago on a plain in the ancient Near East that is now, for the most part, buried under the sediment of 4 millennia of history, waiting for us to dig it up and understand what we are actually looking at. The Sumerian tablets told us first, 2,000 years before anyone else wrote it down. The fire fell, the cities burned, the people fled, the land became desolate, and beings who came from the sky, beings with technology we do not fully understand, beings whose reasons we can read about in texts that have survived 5,000 years in clay, made the decision that it should be so. The tablets are there, the evidence is there. The question has always been whether we are ready to believe what the evidence tells us. That question is still open, and it is the most important question we can ask. There is one more dimension of this story that demands careful examination before we can claim to have done justice to the evidence. It is the dimension that most alternative history documentaries either sensationalize beyond recognition or avoid entirely, because it pushes the inquiry into territory that neither mainstream academia nor popular alternative research has developed the conceptual tools to handle honestly. It is the question of what the Anunnaki wanted, not in the mythological sense of divine purpose, not in the theological sense of God's plan, but in the practical, operational, political sense that the Sumerian texts actually describe. What did these beings want from Earth? What did they want from humanity? And why did their relationship with the civilization they created end the way the texts describe it ending, in destruction, in withdrawal, in the transition from direct governance to distant mythological presence? The Sumerian answer to the question of what the Anunnaki wanted is embedded in the creation narrative itself, and it is an answer that, once you take it seriously, reframes everything else. The Anunnaki came to Earth, the texts say, to work, to extract something. And after the working Anunnaki rebelled against the labor, they created humanity to do that work in their place. What were they extracting? The texts use a word that translates literally as the shining metal, the metal that makes things shine, the metal that reflects light. Modern scholars translate this word as gold. Gold. The Anunnaki came to Earth to mine gold. This is the claim associated most strongly with Zecharia Sitchin, and it is the claim that mainstream scholars most often cite when dismissing Sitchin's work as sensationalism. A civilization capable of interstellar travel coming to Earth to mine gold? The objection seems obvious. Why would any civilization sophisticated enough to cross interstellar space need gold? Gold is heavy, chemically inert, useful in some technological applications, but hardly worth a journey across the galaxy. Except that objection, reasonable as it sounds, misunderstands both what gold is and what it can do. Gold is not valuable only as currency or jewelry. In advanced technology, gold is a critical material. It is the most electrically conductive metal that does not corrode. It is essential in semiconductor technology, in precision electronics, in certain pharmaceutical applications, and in technologies we have not yet developed that may require its unique combination of conductivity, stability, and reflectivity in ways we cannot yet fully appreciate. More significantly, gold has properties at the nanoscale that we are only beginning to understand. At the level of nanoparticles, gold behaves in ways that are chemically and optically different from bulk gold, in ways that have applications in fields ranging from cancer treatment to atmospheric modification, to quantum computing. A civilization with sufficiently advanced technology might have uses for gold that bear no resemblance to our current applications, and that would make the deposits available on Earth worth a journey of any distance. We do not know for certain that gold was what the Anunnaki were extracting. The textual evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. But the broader point holds regardless of the specific material. The Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki as having a specific practical reason for their presence on Earth, a reason that involved the extraction of a material resource, and that reason drove their decision to create a worker species capable of performing the necessary labor. If that is true, then humanity's origin is not the story of divine love creating a being for the purpose of relationship and worship. It is the story of a resource extraction project that required a labor force, and that labor force was created by modifying an existing species on the planet where the resource was located. We are not children of God in the theological sense. We are, in the Sumerian account, engineered workers, created to serve a specific practical purpose, designed with specific capabilities and specific limitations, and crucially, subject to a relationship with our creators that is defined not by love but by utility. This is one of the hardest conclusions that the Sumerian texts point toward, and it is worth sitting with the discomfort it produces. Because if it is true, it does not necessarily mean that our existence is without meaning or value, but it does mean that the meaning and value of our existence are not what most of the religious and philosophical traditions we have inherited told us they were. It means that the relationship between humanity and the divine, as described in those traditions, has been systematically distorted by the passage of time and the loss of the original context. What the earliest Sumerian records describe as a relationship between an engineered species and its engineers became over thousands of years of cultural transmission and theological elaboration, a relationship between creatures and their creator God. The operational detail was lost. The political context was lost. The specific beings with their specific names and their specific agendas were absorbed into the generalized category of the divine, and the story was retold in terms that made sense to civilizations that had no direct knowledge of the Anunnaki, but that preserved the emotional and theological core of the relationship. That is not dishonesty. That is how cultural transmission works. Stories are retold in the terms available to the people retelling them. The original precision is lost, the mythological elaboration takes over, and eventually the story exists only in its mythological form, with its historical origins buried beneath layers of theological interpretation that nobody alive remembers came from somewhere specific and concrete. The Sumerian tablets are the place where we can still see the specific and concrete origin. They are the record closest to the events. They are the least mythologized, the most operational, the most detailed. And what they describe, when read as carefully and honestly as we know how to read them, is a history of Earth that is radically different from the history we were taught. It is a history that begins not with human ingenuity, but with the arrival of beings from above. A history that continues not through independent human development, but through the guided, managed, periodically violent process of a population maintained by an external authority for purposes that authority defined. A history that reaches the crisis point we have been examining in this documentary when the human populations in certain specific areas began to develop capabilities that threatened the established order and were destroyed as a result. And it is a history that continues even now in the absence of the Anunnaki's direct presence, in the shadow of what they built and what they destroyed and what they left behind. Because the civilization we live in today, the cities and states and agricultural systems and writing traditions and legal codes that form the foundation of modern human society, those things did not develop independently from scratch. They developed from the foundations established by the Anunnaki-governed civilization of ancient Sumer. And the religious traditions that provide the deepest layer of meaning for billions of human beings alive today, those traditions trace their roots through various transmission chains, back to the same Sumerian soil where the tablets were written. We are all, in a sense, still living in the aftermath of those events. The fire that fell on those cities 4,000 years ago is still shaping the world we live in. The political and theological decisions that were made in its wake, the withdrawal of direct Anunnaki governance, the transition to remote divine presence, the reframing of political history as theological narrative. These decisions still echo in the religious, political, and cultural structures that organize human life on Earth today. The most important cities in the three monotheistic traditions, Jerusalem for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, is located within a relatively short distance of the Jordan Valley where Tal El Hammam sits. The tradition that made that city sacred, the tradition of Abraham, begins at precisely the historical moment of the events we have been discussing. Abraham, in the biblical narrative, is a contemporary of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. He witnesses it. He negotiates with the divine authority about whether it should happen. And the tradition he founds becomes the dominant religious tradition of the Western world. The timing is not coincidental. The emergence of monotheism, the replacement of the complex, politically organized, operationally specific Anunnaki hierarchy with a single omnipotent and morally concerned God happens precisely at the moment when the direct, operational presence of the Anunnaki in human civilization comes to an end. The theological revolution that produced the three great Abrahamic religions begins at the moment when the beings who had previously served as the direct, physical, politically organized divine authority in human civilization withdrew from that role. The simplest explanation for that coincidence is that the theological revolution was a response to the withdrawal. That when the specific, named, politically organized beings the Sumerian tradition called the Anunnaki were no longer directly present in human civilization, humanity retained the emotional and cognitive need for a relationship with a higher authority. And that need found expression in the development of theological systems that preserve the essential structure of the human-divine relationship, while replacing the specific, operational, politically organized Anunnaki with a single transcendent God whose presence was mediated through faith and prophetic experience, rather than direct physical encounter. This is not a dismissal of monotheism. It is an attempt to understand its historical origins honestly. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is not in this reading a fiction invented to fill a political vacuum. The God of Abraham is the theological crystallization of a real relationship between humanity and a real higher authority, a relationship that had been experienced in very specific and operational terms for thousands of years before the withdrawal, and that continued to be experienced in a transformed and spiritualized form after the withdrawal. The experience was real, the relationship was real, the authority was real, but the form in which it was understood and expressed changed dramatically when the specific beings who embodied that authority were no longer physically present. And the form it took, the form of a single omnipotent God whose presence is mediated through text and tradition and spiritual experience, is the form we have inherited. Understanding that does not diminish the experience of billions of people who have found meaning, comfort, moral guidance, and genuine spiritual insight in their relationship with the God of the monotheistic traditions. What it does is add a historical dimension to that relationship that the traditions themselves have lost track of. It adds the understanding that the authority those traditions describe is not an abstract theological construct that was invented by human imagination. It is, in some form that we do not fully understand, the echo of a real relationship with real beings who were present in human history for a very long time. The fire that fell on those cities 4,000 years ago is part of that history. It is part of the story of that relationship. And understanding it honestly requires us to hold two things at once: the reality of the event, confirmed by physical evidence and preserved in the oldest written records we have, and the reality of the relationship that gave the event its meaning, preserved in the religious traditions that encoded the same events in a different and more enduring language. The tablets of ancient Sumer and the pages of the Hebrew Bible are not contradictions. They are two different records of the same reality, written from different vantage points, in different languages, for different purposes, but describing the same events and the same relationship from different angles. When you read them together, when you take both seriously and allow them to illuminate each other rather than forcing one to disappear in favor of the other, what emerges is something more coherent and more extraordinary than either source provides alone. A history of beings from above who came to Earth with specific purposes, who created humanity for specific reasons, who governed human civilization for thousands of years, who made decisions, some of them terrible in their consequences, based on priorities and values that were not always aligned with humanity's interests, who withdrew, for reasons we do not fully understand, from direct governance of the civilization they had established, who left behind, in the clay tablets of ancient Sumer and in the religious traditions of every civilization on Earth, the memory of what they had done and what they had been, and who perhaps have not left permanently. That is the question that the tablets raise, and that no amount of archaeological excavation will by itself answer. The Sumerian texts do not describe the Anunnaki as having died or destroyed themselves. They describe a withdrawal, a stepping back, a transition from direct governance to remote presence. And the religious traditions that followed in every civilization on Earth consistently describe the divine authority as present but hidden, accessible but not physically manifest, active in history but no longer directly visible. What if that description is accurate? What if the beings described in the Sumerian tablets as the Anunnaki are not a historical phenomenon that ended 4,000 years ago, but an ongoing presence in a form we have not yet learned to recognize with the tools of modern empirical science? This is the question that the tablets ultimately force us to ask. Not whether the events they describe happened, the evidence for that is strong enough to take seriously, but what the ongoing significance of those beings is now, in a world that has forgotten their names, but preserved the memory of their actions in every major religious tradition on Earth. We do not have a definitive answer to that question. Anyone who claims to have a definitive answer is overreaching the evidence. What we have is the tablets, the physical evidence, the consistent global tradition, and the honest acknowledgement that the world we live in was shaped by events and beings that our current understanding of history does not account for. That is enough to be going on with. That is enough to change the way we look at the oldest human records, the most ancient cities, the deepest religious traditions, and the question of who we are and where we came from. The fire fell, the tablets recorded it, the evidence confirmed it. And the beings who sent that fire, whatever they ultimately are, whatever relationship they bear to the present, left marks on this world and on this species that have not faded in 4,000 years and show no sign of fading now. The Sumerian tablets are not mythology. They are the oldest history we have. And the story they tell is the story we are still inside of. The most ancient question any civilization has ever asked is also the most urgent question we face right now. Who made us? Why are we here? And where did they go? The clay tablets of ancient Sumer, sitting in museums around the world, pressed by scribes who have been dead for 5,000 years, contain answers to those questions that we have not yet been honest enough to look at directly. The fire that fell on those two cities is still burning, in a sense, still casting its light across 4,000 years of human history, still illuminating the gap between what we were told and what the evidence says, still waiting for us to stop looking away and begin to understand what we are actually looking at. The tablets are there, the evidence is there, and the trail that begins with a clay disc in the British Museum runs through the destruction layer at Tal el Hammam, through the lamentation over the destruction of Ur, through the book of Genesis and its memory of fire falling on a plain in the ancient Near East, through the global traditions of every civilization that preserved the memory of beings from above. That trail ends in a place that is both terrifying and magnificent. It ends in the recognition that we are not alone in our own history, that we never have been, that the oldest written records we have say so clearly and specifically and with a level of operational detail that should make any honest reader stop and reconsider everything they thought they knew about where humanity came from. The Sumerians knew. They wrote it in clay. The clay survived. The language was deciphered. And now, for the first time in 4,000 years, anyone with the courage to look can read what they wrote and understand what it means. The fire fell. The cities burned. And the beings who sent that fire were not gods in the theological sense. They were something older than theology, something that wrote its presence into the foundation of every civilization that has ever called itself human. We owe it to ourselves to look at that honestly. Whatever we find, it will be more real and more important than anything we were told instead. There is a detail in the Sumerian texts that most alternative history researchers pass over too quickly. And it is a detail that deserves careful attention because it goes to the heart of what makes the Sumerian record so different from every mythological tradition that came after it. The detail is this: the Anunnaki in the Sumerian texts make errors. They disagree with each other. They change their minds. They experience consequences they did not intend. They argue about what to do. They sometimes act impulsively and regret it. They are not omniscient. They are not omnipotent in the unlimited sense that the God of monotheism is described as omnipotent. They are enormously more capable than the humans around them. They live for staggering lengths of time. They possess technology that human civilization cannot replicate, but they are finite. They are limited. They operate within constraints. And the decisions they make, including the decision to destroy the cities of the plain, are described in the text not as the perfect execution of a divine plan, but as the outcome of a political process involving imperfect beings with competing interests and limited information. This is not how mythology works. When human civilizations invent gods to explain natural forces or to organize social behavior, those gods are typically idealized projections of human capabilities, writ large and freed from the limitations that constrain ordinary humans. The Greek gods of Mount Olympus are essentially immortal humans with enhanced powers, but their mythology is explicitly about their relationship to human affairs as external forces, not as governors with administrative responsibilities. The God of monotheism is explicitly unlimited, explicitly omniscient, explicitly beyond human political categories. The Anunnaki of the Sumerian texts are neither of these. They are not unlimited supernatural forces. They are not omniscient administrators making perfect decisions. They are something far more specific and far more mundane. They are a ruling class with advanced capabilities, operating within a defined organizational structure, making decisions that are recorded with the same level of administrative and political detail that Sumerian scribes used when recording the decisions of earthly kings and councils. The text that records the deliberation over the destruction of the cities reads, in its structure and its political logic, more like a minutes of a council meeting than like a mythological narrative. There is a quorum. There are stated positions. There is a majority position and a minority position. There is a final decision made by the authority with the highest rank. There is a record of who voted which way. This is not how ancient civilizations recorded divine action. This is how they recorded institutional decision-making. And the reason it reads that way is almost certainly because that is what it is. A record preserved and transmitted with whatever fidelity the tradition could manage across the gap of centuries, of an actual decision made by an actual institution in the actual political circumstances of the ancient Near East 4,000 years ago. The minority position, Enki's objection to the total destruction, is particularly significant because it is not presented as impiety or as theological error. It is presented as a legitimate political argument within the established framework of Anunnaki governance. Enki makes his case. His case is heard, his case is overruled. And then, crucially, he acts on the margins of the decision to mitigate its worst consequences by warning the individual who becomes the Sumerian equivalent of the biblical Lot. This is institutional behavior. This is what happens inside any organization when a decision is made over someone's objection. They comply with the decision while finding whatever space is available within the margins of compliance to act according to their own values. Enki cannot stop the destruction, but he can warn one person, and he does. That level of institutional nuance is not mythology. Mythology does not have institutional nuance. Mythology has heroes and villains and divine plans executed perfectly. The Sumerian texts have something that looks much more like a bureaucracy having a very bad day and making a decision that everyone involved will regret in various ways for a very long time. This is again consistent with what we know about how actual complex organizations make decisions. They don't make them perfectly. They make them in the context of competing interests, imperfect information, time pressure, and political constraints that limit what any individual actor within the organization can do. The decision to destroy the cities of the plain, as described in the Sumerian texts, is the kind of decision that an actual organization with actual decision-making processes makes, not the kind of decision that an all-powerful deity with perfect knowledge makes. The being who made it, Enlil, is explicitly described in the text as having made similar decisions before. The flood narrative places the decision to destroy humanity by water in Enlil's hands as well. He has a pattern. When human civilization presents a challenge to the established order that he judges to be irresolvable by less extreme means, his response is elimination. He is not cruel in the casual sense. He does not enjoy destruction. But he has a very high threshold for what he considers an acceptable risk, and a very low threshold for what he considers an appropriate response to threats that exceed that risk level. This consistency of character across multiple major events spanning centuries of textual record is itself significant. Mythological figures do not have consistent characters in the sense that real individuals do. Their characteristics are adjusted to serve the narrative requirements of each individual story. Enlil's character in the flood texts and Enlil's character in the destruction texts are consistent not because a brilliant mythmaker created a coherent fictional personality, but because both sets of texts are drawing on records of the same actual individual making decisions in the same way across different crisis situations. The same consistency applies to Enki. His role as the advocate for humanity, the mitigator of Enlil's extreme decisions, the being who finds ways to preserve human life even when the formal authority has decided to destroy it, is consistent across every major text in which both of them appear. He is not inconsistent the way mythological figures are inconsistent when different scribes in different cities retell the same stories with different emphases. He is consistent in the way that real people with stable values and stable personalities are consistent across different situations. This is the quality of the Sumerian record that makes it so difficult to dismiss as mythology and so important to take seriously. The internal coherence of the political relationships and the institutional structures described across thousands of years of independent textual production, the consistency of character across multiple events separated by centuries, the level of operational and administrative detail that has no function in a purely mythological narrative. These are the hallmarks of a tradition that is preserving the memory of real events with real actors in a real institutional context. The events described are extraordinary by the standards of anything we consider possible within our current understanding of human history, but the way they are described is not extraordinary. It is the way Sumerian scribes described everything that was important and worth preserving, with precision, with detail, with attention to the political and institutional context that shaped the decisions and events they were recording. If we take that description seriously, if we grant the Sumerians the same credibility we grant any other ancient civilization's records of its own experience, then the conclusion is unavoidable. The Anunnaki were real. The events described in the texts happened. The fire fell on those cities, not because an omnipotent deity decided that the moral failings of their populations warranted total destruction, but because a specific authority within a specific organizational hierarchy, facing a specific political situation that it judged to be an unacceptable threat to the established order, made a political decision to use a weapon of extraordinary destructive capability against a specific geographic target. And that decision and that weapon and the political situation that produced it are all recorded in clay tablets that have been sitting in museums for 150 years. The question of what we do with that knowledge, now that we can read those tablets and cross-reference their contents with the physical evidence from the archaeological sites and the corroborating traditions from every civilization on Earth that preserve the same memories, is the question that this documentary ultimately leaves open. Because it is not a question that can be answered by a documentary. It is a question that can only be answered by the sustained, serious, honest engagement of the best minds our civilization has to offer with the oldest records our species has preserved. That engagement has not yet happened. The academic establishment has not taken the Sumerian texts seriously as historical documents rather than mythological elaborations. The alternative history community has taken them seriously, but not always rigorously, often overreaching the evidence in ways that make it easy for the academic establishment to dismiss the entire field. The gap between those two positions, between reflexive dismissal and credulous overclaiming, is the space where the real work needs to happen, and that real work is beginning. The evidence from Tal el-Hammam, published in a mainstream scientific journal, is a beginning. The growing number of researchers who are taking the Sumerian texts seriously as historical documents, who are applying the same rigorous standards of textual analysis to cuneiform tablets that are applied to Greek and Roman and Hebrew texts, is a beginning. The development of better dating techniques and better geological analysis methods that allow us to reconstruct the events of 4,000 years ago with increasing precision is a beginning. The beginning is happening. The question is whether the conclusion we eventually reach will be the comfortable conclusion that mainstream scholarship prefers, or the uncomfortable conclusion that the evidence has been pointing toward all along. There is a specific passage in the lamentation over the destruction of Ur that deserves to be quoted in translation, because it captures better than any paraphrase can the quality of the Sumerian textual record and the reason that quality should command our serious attention. The text, in the translation of Samuel Noah Kramer, one of the 20th century's greatest Sumerologists, reads in part as follows: "The storm that annihilates the land, the storm ordered by Enlil in hate, the storm which wears away the country, the storm which knows no grain, these storms will make the land tremble and shake, the evil winds and the storm. They will make the people of the land mourn." Kramer translated this as poetry, as lamentation, as the mythological expression of grief, And it is certainly all of those things. But it is also, when read as a technical description of a real atmospheric event, a remarkably accurate account of what a large-scale airburst or atmospheric dispersal of toxic material would produce. A storm that annihilates, that knows no grain, meaning it does not discriminate between cultivated and uncultivated land. It destroys indiscriminately. That makes the land tremble and shake, which is a description of the seismic and acoustic effects of a large explosion. That makes the people mourn, not just because it is sad, but because it kills them. The specific phrase that knows no grain is particularly significant. It means the storm does not spare the agricultural land. It is not a military force that attacks people while leaving the farmland relatively intact. It is something that destroys the agricultural capacity of the land along with the people, which is again consistent with either a large-scale airburst destroying the topsoil and vegetation over a wide area, or a chemical or radiological contamination that renders the soil unable to support crops for an extended period. The Sumerians had seen military attacks. They knew what an invading army looked like and what it did. The vocabulary they used to describe military destruction is different from the vocabulary they used to describe the evil wind. Military destruction is directional. It comes from the territory of the enemy. Military destruction is selective. The enemy kills the fighters and takes the valuables and enslaves the survivors. Military destruction does not make the land itself hostile to human habitation. But the evil wind does all of these things that military attack does not do. And the Sumerian scribes, who were precise about vocabulary, used different vocabulary to describe it because they understood that it was something categorically different from anything they had a conventional military or natural disaster category for. That specificity, that careful distinction between the familiar and the unprecedented, is exactly what you would expect from a scribal tradition trying to record something genuinely outside its experience. They did not reach for the standard vocabulary of military defeat or natural disaster. They created new descriptions for something they had never encountered before. And the descriptions they created, preserved across multiple texts and multiple centuries of transmission, describe an event whose physical characteristics match what we find in the archaeological record at Tal el-Hammam with a precision that should, by any honest standard, give us pause. We have been trained by our educational institutions and our cultural assumptions to treat the gap between ancient texts and modern physical evidence as an unbridgeable one. Ancient people did not understand natural phenomena scientifically, therefore their descriptions of extraordinary events are mythology. This assumption, reasonable as it sounds, breaks down when applied to the Sumerian record for a very specific reason. The Sumerians were not scientifically unsophisticated in the modern sense. They were the inventors of systematic record-keeping. They were the people who developed mathematics precise enough to calculate compound interest and astronomical observations accurate enough to predict eclipses. Their scribal tradition was built on a commitment to precision that is evident in every aspect of their output. The assumption that such a tradition would respond to a catastrophic event by retreating into mythology rather than trying to describe it as precisely as their vocabulary allowed is not consistent with everything else we know about how Sumerian scribal culture worked. The more consistent assumption is that they described what they saw and what had been described to them by those who saw it before them as precisely as they could. And what that precision produced is a description of an event whose physical characteristics we can now match to the archaeological record. Not perfectly, not without ambiguity, but with enough specificity that the match cannot reasonably be dismissed as coincidence. The tablets are trying to tell us something. They have been trying to tell us something for 5,000 years, and we are finally slowly beginning to have the tools and the willingness to listen. The tablets are the oldest answer we have to the oldest questions we ask. They deserve to be read honestly. And the fire they describe, falling on those two cities in the ancient Near East more than 4,000 years ago, deserves to be understood for what the oldest written records on Earth say it was. Not an act of nature misunderstood by primitive minds, not a theological narrative invented to explain moral principles, but an event, real and violent and deliberately executed, that shaped the course of human civilization in ways we are still living with today. The tablets know. The clay remembers. And somewhere in the storerooms of the British Museum, in the storage vaults of the University of Pennsylvania, in the collections of museums across Europe and the Middle East, the rest of the story is waiting, in clay, in a language 5,000 years old, written by people who understood in a way that we have spent 150 years refusing to accept, that what they recorded was not myth. It was history, their history, our history, the history that explains why we are what we are, why we live the way we live, why we have the religious traditions we have, why the oldest questions human beings ask are the questions we have never stopped asking. Who made us? Why are we here? And when will they return? The tablets of ancient Sumer do not answer the last question, but they answer the first two with a specificity and a clarity that should, by any honest standard of historical inquiry, command our complete and sustained attention. We were made by beings from above. We are here because they needed workers. And everything that has happened in the 4,000 years since they withdrew from direct governance of the civilization they created has been the story of a species trying to make meaning from the memory of a relationship it no longer fully understands, but has never been able to forget. The fire fell. The tablets recorded it. The evidence confirms it. And the question is ours to answer now, with everything we know and everything we are willing to know. The oldest history we have is waiting for us to finally honestly read it.